Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. A few years ago, my girlfriend and I planned a vacation to celebrate my birthday. We were heading to a coastal area in Southern California with a tropical climate, which was perfect since we live in a place where it's cold most of the year. For this trip, my girlfriend had rented an apartment through Airbnb that was very close to the beach. It had everything we needed and was surprisingly affordable. I should mention that the person renting it out was listed as a woman, which gave my girlfriend even more confidence in the booking. When the day of our trip arrived, we reached our accommodation and were pleasantly surprised by how spacious it was. The apartment was quite large and modestly decorated, but nothing that bothered us. We really just wanted a place to sleep since we planned to spend most of our time exploring the area. The first night, we arrived completely exhausted and went straight to bed. We fell asleep within seconds, but I woke up in the middle of the night when I heard a noise. I couldn't quite tell where it had come from. My girlfriend was sleeping deeply, so I didn't want to wake her or frighten her. I got up to get a glass of water, and as I was walking to the kitchen, I heard another thud, but this time it seemed to come from upstairs. I immediately ran back to check on my girlfriend since she was sleeping upstairs, thinking that someone might have broken in and could be putting her in danger. But when I went up, I first checked our bedroom and then the adjacent room, but there was nobody there. My girlfriend apparently hadn't heard anything because she was sleeping so soundly. The next day, I didn't mention anything about what had happened during the night. I didn't want to worry her and ruin the day we had planned at the beach. But coincidentally, while we were sitting on the sand, she said to me, "I want to tell you something, but I don't want you to worry. Ever since we arrived at the apartment, I feel like someone is watching us all the time. I sense the presence of someone else. It's a strange feeling I've had since we first walked into the place." When she told me this, I was speechless. I asked her why she hadn't said anything earlier, and she said it was precisely because she didn't want to worry me. But there was something about that place that made her uncomfortable. I asked if she wanted us to change locations or sleep in a hotel that night, but she said no, that maybe it was just her imagination and she didn't want to spend more money on accommodation since we had already reserved that place for the next 4 nights. So we just let it go. That night I stayed with her at all times inside the apartment so she wouldn't feel alone. But it was strange, because I also started to feel the same way. And as if that wasn't enough, in the early morning hours, I heard those sounds again. This time I paid closer attention, and they sounded like someone walking very slowly. But since the apartment had wooden floors, you couldn't avoid hearing the footsteps no matter how slowly someone moved. I checked the place again, but found nobody there. This was starting to worry me because I didn't want my girlfriend to be exposed to any danger. I stayed awake all night to watch over her, but I didn't hear anything else. However, that morning, while my girlfriend was taking a shower, I heard someone crying inside the house. In fact, it sounded very close, as if it were coming from the room right next to ours. But when I went to check, there was nobody anywhere. It was extremely strange, but I was about to discover the most terrifying part of the situation. I approached very slowly toward the wall that was directly behind the headboard of our bed. That's where the crying sound was coming from, a man's crying. Each time I listened, I could hear it more clearly. The apartment was supposed to be separate from the others, and as far as I knew, that wall faced the exterior. But I was wrong. I examined the wall carefully and noticed that there were several small holes in the upper part. That wooden wall was completely perforated. Very slowly, I climbed onto the bed, almost without breathing so as not to make any noise. When I looked through one of those holes, I saw an old mattress and a lamp that was turned on. I couldn't see anyone from where I was looking, but it was obvious that it was a clandestine room that was inside our apartment. The most terrifying part was that someone was living there while we were staying in the place. When my girlfriend came out of the shower, I signaled for her to be quiet. I grabbed the few things I could, and we got out of there immediately. My girlfriend was very scared and didn't understand what was happening, but once we were on the street, I explained everything to her. She cried, terrified, knowing that all this time she had been right to feel that someone was watching us. We called the police, who immediately arrived at the location since it was a tourist area and there was always surveillance nearby. I told them what had happened, and they entered the place. They discovered that the door to that hidden room was in the other bedroom, behind a wardrobe. Sure enough, they found a man about 45 years old inside, dirty, with a long beard and half naked. We sent very angry messages to the host, but she never responded. We filed a police report and also made a complaint through the app. But later we discovered that the real host was that man, who had been using his mother's identification to create that profile. His mother lived in another city with his sister and wasn't aware of anything her son was doing. The man was renting out the place that his mother had left him, so he could spy on the guests who stayed there without them knowing what was happening. The man was arrested because they also confirmed that he had illegal weapons and was consuming substances that weren't permitted. That terror we experienced traumatized us, and now we only stay in hotels or with users who have many reviews. That was several years ago, and now the platform has more security measures to prevent this from happening again. But without a doubt, you always have to be suspicious of everything. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. My name is Alex, and I've been a passionate road trip enthusiast for as long as I can remember. I've always loved the feeling of freedom that comes from being on the road, discovering new places, and having stories to tell. I've had many experiences traveling, but there's one in particular that still gives me chills every time I remember it. It's a story I feel the need to share. Picture this, a family trip, a father, a mother, and their young son, deciding to make a stop at a small roadside motel to rest for one night before continuing the journey. That family was us. We had spent the entire day driving, and just as the sun began to set, we arrived at the motel. It was the typical place you might find in a Stephen King novel, with a flickering neon sign and an air of abandonment that put your nerves on edge. The place was called the Moonlight Motor Lodge, and it sat at the intersection of two forgotten highways in rural Missouri. The building was a long, low structure painted in what had once been cheerful yellow, but had faded to the color of old mustard. A kidney-shaped swimming pool dominated the center courtyard, its turquoise paint peeling, and the water, a murky green that suggested the filtration system, had given up years ago. After checking in and leaving our things in the room, exhaustion completely overcame me. My wife, Sarah, and I collapsed on the bed, but not my son, Jake. He's always been a poor sleeper, and that night was no exception. I remember him tossing and turning, unable to get comfortable in the unfamiliar bed. It wasn't long before I heard him get up and approach the window. "Dad, there's a girl at the pool," he murmured with a tone of curiosity. I groaned, trying to clear the sleep from my eyes. "What girl?" I responded with some annoyance as I approached the window. And there she was, a small girl, about 8 or 9 years old, sitting on the edge of the pool with her feet barely touching the water. She was just watching the water without moving. Something about her presence immediately made me uncomfortable. What struck me most was how she was dressed. She wore a white dress that seemed to glow in the moonlight, but it was clearly from another era, maybe the 1950s or 60s, with puffy sleeves and a full skirt that spread around her like a flower. Her hair was styled in neat curls that framed her pale face, and she wore small white shoes that dangled just above the water's surface. I tried to rationalize it. She must be another guest, I thought, so I went back to bed and told Jake to lie down again, but he didn't listen to me. Instead, he waved at her, a friendly greeting. He says the girl turned to look at him as if she had felt that greeting but didn't respond. Then, without warning, she let herself fall into the water and disappeared beneath the surface. Jake waited. A few seconds passed, then a minute, but she never came up for air. The feeling of panic was immediate. Jake shook me urgently, demanding that I help her and wake up his mother. We jumped out of bed and ran toward the pool, with the cold night air chilling us to the bone. But when we arrived, the pool was completely calm. Not a single trace of the girl, neither inside nor outside the water. The water was perfectly still, like glass. No ripples, no bubbles, no sign that anyone had disturbed its surface. The only sound was the gentle hum of the old filter system and the distant buzz of the neon sign. Jake insisted on what he had seen. He didn't hesitate or doubt. He swore the girl was there. Not knowing what else to do, we decided to report it at the front desk, hoping for a response that would give us some peace of mind. The man at the reception, a guy with a tired appearance and dull eyes, listened to us patiently, but his reaction wasn't what I expected. He didn't seem surprised. Instead, he sighed with resignation. In a low tone, he told us there were no other guests at the motel. He hesitated for a moment before confessing something that, according to him, he shouldn't be saying. Years ago, a girl had drowned in that pool. Since then, some customers claimed to have seen her. He said she was just a soul in limbo, trapped at an intermediate point. The desk clerk's name was Earl, and he looked like he'd been working nights at roadside motels for decades. His face was weathered, and his eyes held the kind of weariness that comes from seeing too much. He leaned across the counter and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. Her name was Lucy Patterson, he said, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear. Happened back in 1967. She was here with her family, driving cross-country for a vacation. Little thing, just turned 9 that week. Her parents were having drinks in the room, celebrating their anniversary, when she slipped out to go swimming. He paused, rubbing his stubbled chin. Pool didn't have proper lighting back then, and the safety regulations weren't what they are now. No one knows exactly what happened, but they found her the next morning. Been seeing her ever since, especially on nights when families with children stay here. He made it clear that his boss forbade him from talking about the topic with customers, precisely so as not to scare them. But he was tired of receiving so many complaints from guests who reported strange things. He told us we weren't the first to see the girl. We were left in a state of total unease. We didn't know what to think. It was late, and I was too exhausted to drive, so we decided to stay, intending to leave as soon as dawn broke. But sleep was impossible. At some point in the early morning, Sarah woke up suddenly with a muffled scream. She was pale, her eyes wide open. She told me she had seen a small figure standing at the foot of the bed. I immediately turned on the lamp, but there was no one there. And then Jake. With a trembling voice, he said he felt a wet hand touch his face. But when he described it, he said it wasn't scary. It felt gentle, almost protective, like someone checking to make sure he was okay. That's when I noticed something else. The room was cold, unnaturally cold, and there was a faint smell of chlorine in the air, even though we were nowhere near the pool. Sarah pointed to the window, and we both saw handprints on the glass, small, child-sized handprints that seemed to be pressed from the outside. That was the last straw. We didn't care that it was still early morning. We packed our things as fast as possible and got out of there before the sun came up. As we loaded our car, I took one last look at the pool. In the growing light of dawn, I could see something I hadn't noticed before, a small memorial plaque near the diving board, so weathered and overgrown with weeds that it was almost invisible. I couldn't make out all the words, but I could see Lucy, and never forgotten, etched into the tarnished metal. Sometimes I look back and still don't understand what really happened that night. Maybe it was just a series of coincidences that our minds tied together. Or maybe there was something more, something we shouldn't have seen. But if there's one thing I learned from that experience, it's that some places have stories that are better left undiscovered. And the next time I have to make a stop on the road, I'll make sure it's not at an empty motel with a lonely pool in the night. I've always believed that the scariest things aren't those that appear out of nowhere or attack you in the dark. What's truly terrifying is what defies logic, what makes you question whether your mind is playing tricks on you or whether, in reality, the world is stranger than we think. The Moonlight Motor Lodge was demolished 2 years later, but I heard they kept the memorial plaque and moved it to the local cemetery. Sometimes I wonder if Lucy finally found peace, or if she's still looking for other children to watch over, still trying to make sure they don't meet the same fate she did. Some stories don't have clear endings, and maybe that's what makes them so haunting. All I know is that every time I see a child near water, I watch a little more carefully, and I remember a little girl in a white dress who may still be looking out for the living from wherever she is now. This happened during my sophomore year at Northwestern University. I was studying pre-law on a scholarship, which was a huge opportunity for someone from a small town in Nebraska like me. The university was in Chicago, about 12 hours from my hometown, so whenever I had breaks, I'd drive back to visit my parents. It was a long drive, but I enjoyed the solitude and the time to think. I'd usually stop somewhere around the halfway point to rest for a few hours before continuing on. There was a decent hotel near Des Moines that I'd stayed at several times before. But this particular trip, I was running later than usual and still had about 3 hours to go when exhaustion started setting in. I knew there was a small motel somewhere along this stretch of highway. I'd passed it many times, but never paid much attention to it. It was one of those old roadside places that you only notice when you really need it. The Prairie Wind Motel sat about a quarter-mile off the main highway, connected by a cracked asphalt road that hadn't been repaired in years. The building looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. Faded yellow paint, a flickering neon sign, and a parking lot with more weeds than asphalt. Only one other car was parked outside, and I couldn't tell if it belonged to a guest or an employee. I was too tired to care about the aesthetics. I just needed a few hours of sleep before hitting the road again. A young guy, probably around my age, was working the night shift at the front desk. He seemed friendly enough and gave me a room on the ground floor toward the back of the building. The room was basic, but appeared clean, which was all that mattered to me at that point. I kicked off my shoes and collapsed onto the bed fully clothed. I was so exhausted from studying for midterms and then driving for 8 hours that I fell asleep almost immediately. I slept deeply for what felt like hours. In my dream, I was back in that same motel room, lying in the exact same position, but there was someone lying next to me on the bed. In the dream, I could feel this presence beside me, breathing heavily and watching me sleep. The breathing was labored and irregular, like someone who was struggling for air. I could feel the heat from their body and smell something unpleasant, a musty, stale odor that reminded me of old clothes that had been stored in a damp basement for too long. In the dream, I was terrified but couldn't move or open my eyes. I just lay there, feeling this thing next to me, listening to its ragged breathing getting closer and closer to my ear. The breathing became more and more agitated, and I could sense that whatever was lying beside me was becoming increasingly restless. Then I felt something cold and clammy touch my arm. That's when I realized I wasn't dreaming. My eyes snapped open, but I was facing away from the center of the bed, looking toward the door. I was completely awake now, but the presence was still there. I could still hear that terrible breathing, still smell that awful odor, still feel the heat radiating from whatever was lying next to me. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it could hear it. I wanted to turn around and see what was there, but I was paralyzed with fear. Some instinct told me that if I moved or showed any sign that I was awake, something terrible would happen. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, trying to control my breathing and remain perfectly still. The thing next to me continued its labored breathing, and occasionally I would feel it shift slightly, as if it was trying to get more comfortable. Then I felt something that nearly made me scream, a hand, ice cold and skeletal, slowly reaching across my body and resting on my arm. The fingers were long and thin, with what felt like sharp nails that pressed lightly into my skin. I don't know how I managed to remain motionless, but somehow I did. Every instinct in my body was telling me to run, but I forced myself to stay still and keep my breathing steady. After what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes, I felt the hand withdraw. The presence beside me seemed to shift and move, and then I heard the sound of footsteps moving around the room. I still didn't dare to move or open my eyes fully, but I could sense that whatever had been lying next to me was now standing somewhere in the room. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, like someone who was in no hurry and was simply exploring the space. Finally, I heard what sounded like the bathroom door opening and closing. That's when I knew I had to get out of there. I jumped out of bed and looked back at where I'd been lying. The covers on the other side of the bed were disturbed, as if someone had indeed been lying there. There was even an indentation in the pillow where a head might have been resting. I grabbed my keys and ran to my car without even bothering to collect my overnight bag. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. But finally, the engine started, and I drove straight home without stopping. I drove for the remaining 4 hours through the night, fueled by adrenaline and fear. Every time I started to feel drowsy, I'd remember that cold hand touching my arm, and I'd be wide awake again. When I finally reached my parents' house, I was exhausted but too shaken to sleep. I told my mom I'd had car trouble and had to drive through the night, but I never told anyone the real reason I'd left the motel so abruptly. For weeks afterward, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I'd start to doze off, I'd feel like there was someone watching me or lying next to me in bed. I even went to the campus counseling center because I thought I might be having some kind of breakdown from stress. It took months before I could sleep normally again, and to this day, I can't sleep in unfamiliar places without thoroughly checking every corner of the room first. I always request rooms on upper floors now, and I never stay anywhere that doesn't have good reviews and plenty of other guests. I've tried to rationalize what happened that night. Maybe it was a vivid nightmare brought on by exhaustion, or maybe there was someone hiding in my room who left while I was pretending to sleep. But deep down, I know what I experienced was real. Something was in that bed with me, something that had no business being in the world of the living. Whether it was the spirit of someone who had died in that room or something even worse, I'll never know. But I learned an important lesson that night. Some places hold onto their darkness, and the Prairie Wind Motel was definitely one of them. I took a different route home after that, even though it added an extra hour to my drive. Some detours are worth taking when they help you avoid encountering things that should stay buried in the past. This story takes place in 2015, when I was 24 years old and desperately trying to save money for college. I've been working odd jobs since graduating high school, but nothing that paid well enough to cover tuition and living expenses. That's when my Uncle Frank offered me a position as a night desk clerk at a roadside motel he owned with 2 business partners. The Moonlight Motor Inn was located about 45 minutes outside of Tucson, right off Interstate 10. It wasn't exactly a luxury establishment, more like one of those places that truckers and travelers used when they needed a cheap place to crash for a few hours. But Uncle Frank was offering $15 an hour for the night shift, which was good money back then, especially for someone with no experience. The job seemed straightforward enough. I'd work from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., checking in the occasional late arrival, handling any problems that came up, and basically just keeping an eye on things. Uncle Frank warned me that the previous night clerk had quit suddenly, but he said it was probably just because the isolation got to him. Some people can't handle being alone all night, he explained. But you've always been independent, so I think you'll do fine. My shift ran Sunday through Thursday nights, which meant I had weekends free and could sleep during the day when it was easier to block out noise and light. The motel typically had very few guests during weeknights, so most of the time I'd be reading or studying for the college entrance exams I was planning to take. For the first 3 weeks, everything went smoothly. I'd maybe check in 2 or 3 guests per night, handle the occasional complaint about noisy neighbors or broken air conditioning, and spend the rest of my time preparing for my future education. It was actually a pretty good setup. That changed on a Thursday night in late September. It was around 1:30 in the morning, and the motel was unusually quiet. We only had one occupied room that night, a couple who checked in around 10 p.m. and said they'd be leaving early in the morning. I was reading a test prep book when I heard a car pull into the parking lot. A man got out and walked toward the office. He was tall and heavy-set, with a thick beard and long hair that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. His clothes were dirty and ill-fitting, jeans that were too tight, and a button-down shirt that looked like it belonged to someone else. What really caught my attention, though, was that he was barefoot and appeared to be sweating heavily, as if he'd been running or exerting himself physically. "Good evening," I said as he entered the office. "How can I help you?" He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he just stood near the door, staring at me with an intense, unsettling gaze. There was something in his eyes that made me deeply uncomfortable, a coldness that suggested he was capable of things I didn't want to think about. "You want to rent a room?" I asked, trying to maintain a professional demeanor despite my growing unease. Again, no response. He started walking slowly toward the counter where I was sitting, but stopped about halfway across the office. He kept his hands in his pockets the entire time, and I noticed that his pants were so tight that the pockets bulged noticeably, as if he was carrying something large in each one. That's when I really looked at his shirt and realized I'd seen it before. It was identical to the one worn by the man who'd checked in earlier that evening. Same color, same style, even the same small stain on the left sleeve. My heart started racing as I realized the stranger was wearing the guest's clothes. The implications of that were terrifying. I tried to remain calm and act like I hadn't noticed anything unusual. "Sir, do you need a room for the night?" He continued to stare at me without speaking. His breathing was heavy and irregular, and I could smell something unpleasant, a mixture of sweat, dirt, and something else I couldn't identify. Just then, the phone rang. I'd never been so grateful to hear that sound in my life. It was Uncle Frank, and his voice was urgent. "Raoul, listen to me carefully. There's been an escape from the state psychiatric hospital about 20 miles from the motel. The guy is considered extremely dangerous, and the police think he might be headed in your direction." I glanced at the man standing in my office and managed to say, "Okay." He was wearing a blue hospital uniform when he escaped, Uncle Frank continued. "The authorities are searching the area now, but I wanted to warn you to be extra careful. Has anyone unusual come in tonight?" Looking directly at the man, I answered, "Yes." Uncle Frank immediately understood that I was in danger. "Is he there with you right now?" "Yes." "Okay, stay calm. I'm calling the police right now and I'm on my way. Don't hang up the phone and don't do anything that might provoke him." I set the phone down but left the line open. The man was still standing there watching me, but something in his demeanor had changed. He started laughing, a deep, uncontrolled laughter that sent chills down my spine. It went on for what felt like forever, this maniacal cackling that filled the small office. And he pulled his hands out of his pockets, and I saw that they were covered in dried blood. He began wiping tears from his eyes with those bloody hands, still laughing hysterically. That's when he started dancing. It wasn't normal dancing. It was erratic, jerky movements that looked more like seizures than any kind of coordinated motion. He spun around and gyrated in ways that no sane person would move, all while continuing to laugh and cry at the same time. And he pulled something from his back pocket, a large kitchen knife with blood on the blade. He began incorporating the knife into his bizarre dance, waving it around and making stabbing motions in the air. Sometimes he'd stop laughing and start screaming instead, but the words were incomprehensible. I sat frozen behind the counter, afraid that any movement might trigger him to attack. I could hear Uncle Frank's voice coming from the phone receiver, asking if I was okay, but I didn't dare pick it up and respond. Finally, I saw the flashing lights of police cars in the distance. They were approaching with their sirens off, probably to avoid alerting the escaped patient, but I could see them coming down the highway. The man was so absorbed in his demented performance that he didn't notice the police cars until they were pulling into the parking lot. When he did see them, he suddenly stopped dancing and charged toward one of the officers as they entered the office. He managed to cut the officer's hand with the knife, but it wasn't a serious injury. The other officers quickly subdued him and got him handcuffed. They had to carry him to the patrol car because he kept trying to lie down on the ground and wouldn't walk. After they'd taken him away, another officer led me outside to get some air and take my statement. That's when I saw what had become of the couple who'd checked in earlier. Their bodies were lying in the parking lot near their car. They'd been stabbed multiple times and left in pools of blood. The sight was so horrific that I immediately broke down and started crying. The officer tried to shield me from the scene, but it was too late. That image is burned into my memory forever. I quit that same night. Uncle Frank completely understood and didn't try to talk me out of it. The motel's reputation was destroyed after the murders became public, and it eventually went out of business within a year. I ended up needing therapy to deal with the trauma of that night. For months afterward, I had nightmares about that man's laugh and his bizarre dancing. I also couldn't stop thinking about how close I'd come to becoming his next victim. Investigation revealed that the escaped patient had a history of violent crimes and had been institutionalized after killing several people in different states. Apparently, he had a pattern of stalking his victims for hours or days before attacking them, which might explain why he'd spent so much time just watching me. I never found out why he didn't attack me that night. Maybe it was because he knew the police were coming, or maybe he was waiting for the right moment and they arrived before he could act. I'll never know, and I'm grateful for that uncertainty. I did eventually save enough money for college, though it took me longer than planned since I had to find a different job. I ended up working construction during the day, which was physically demanding, but at least kept me around other people. I moved to Canada a few years later for graduate school and ended up staying permanently. Sometimes people ask me why I left the United States, and I usually give them practical reasons like job opportunities or health care. But the truth is, I wanted to put as much distance as possible between myself and the memories of that night at the Moonlight Motor Inn. Some experiences change you forever, and some jobs aren't worth any amount of money. I learned both of those lessons the hard way, but I'm grateful to be alive to tell this story. This happened about 5 years ago when I was working as a sales representative for a medical equipment company. My colleague Jake and I were driving from Phoenix to Salt Lake City for a big presentation, and we'd seriously underestimated how long the drive would take. By the time we reached the middle of Nevada, it was already past midnight, and I was struggling to keep my eyes open. "We need to stop," I told Jake. "I can't drive safely anymore." Jake had recently gotten glasses and couldn't see well enough to drive at night, so stopping was our only option. That's when we spotted the Sunset Motor Inn, a small, run-down motel right off Highway 93. It wasn't exactly the Ritz, but it was the only place for miles. The elderly couple who owned the place seemed nice enough. The woman was probably in her 70s, with gray hair pulled back in a bun, and her husband looked to be about the same age. They moved slowly, but were polite and welcoming. We rented a room with 2 beds and headed upstairs. Jake was exhausted and fell asleep almost immediately. I've always suffered from insomnia, especially when I'm in unfamiliar places, so I lay there staring at the ceiling for what felt like hours. I was just starting to drift off when I heard it, a child's voice singing softly from somewhere nearby. At first, I thought it might be coming from another room, but as I listened more carefully, I realized the sound was coming from our bathroom. My eyes snapped open, and I held my breath to listen more carefully. It was definitely a little girl's voice, singing what sounded like a lullaby. The melody was sweet but haunting, and it was definitely coming from behind our bathroom door. I whispered Jake's name, trying to wake him without making too much noise, but he was dead to the world. I got up and gently shook his shoulder. "Jake," I whispered, "wake up." The singing stopped abruptly. Jake groaned and rolled over. "What's wrong? What time is it? Did you hear that singing?" I asked. He rubbed his eyes and sat up slightly. "Singing? You probably just dreamed it. Go back to sleep." But before he could lie back down, the singing started again. This time, Jake heard it too. His eyes widened and he sat up straight. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. "That's what I've been trying to tell you," I said. "It's coming from our bathroom." We both sat there listening to the ethereal voice of what sounded like a young girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old. The song was unfamiliar to me, but it had an old-fashioned quality to it, like something from the 1950s. "Go check it out," Jake whispered. "Why me?" I whispered back. "Because you heard it first." I was terrified, but I couldn't just lie there wondering what was in our bathroom. Jake got up with me, and we both crept toward the bathroom door. As we got closer, the singing grew louder and clearer. I reached for the door handle, and the singing stopped again. I turned on the light and pushed the door open. The bathroom was completely empty. We checked behind the shower curtain, looked in the small cabinet under the sink, even checked to see if there were any vents or openings where sound might be coming from another room. "Nothing. That was really weird," Jake said, "but there's obviously nothing here. Let's just go back to bed." We returned to our beds, but neither of us could fall asleep. About 20 minutes later, the singing started again. This time, it seemed even louder and more persistent. "That's it," Jake said, jumping out of bed. "I'm going to the front desk. This is insane." I followed him downstairs to the small office where the elderly couple had checked us in. We knocked on the door and waited. When no one answered, Jake knocked harder. "Hello? We need to speak with you about something in our room." Still no answer. Jake tried the door and found it unlocked. We stepped inside and called out, but the place seemed deserted. That's when I saw them. The elderly couple was lying on the floor behind the front desk, both of them obviously dead. There was blood everywhere, and it was clear they'd been murdered. The woman's glasses were shattered, and the man's shirt was torn and bloody. Jake immediately turned and ran back toward our room. I wanted to call the police, but I realized my cell phone was upstairs, and the landline in the office had been ripped from the wall. I ran after Jake, taking the stairs 2 at a time. I burst into our room. He was sitting on his bed, crying and shaking. "We have to get out of here," I said. "Whoever did this might still be around." That's when the singing started again. But this time, we both realized something that made our blood run cold. The voice wasn't that of a little girl at all. It was a grown man singing in a high, childlike voice, and he was in our bathroom. We froze, afraid to move or make any sound. Then we heard footsteps, and the bathroom door slowly creaked open. A tall, thin man emerged from the bathroom, holding a large kitchen knife. His clothes were covered in blood, and he was still singing that same lullaby in that creepy, high-pitched voice. He looked directly at us and smiled. I grabbed Jake's arm and pulled him toward the door. He was in complete shock and could barely move, but adrenaline gave me the strength to drag him along. We ran to our car. And of course, it wouldn't start, just like in a horror movie. I turned the key again and again, pumping the gas pedal frantically. "Come on, come on," I shouted. Finally, on the 5th try, the engine turned over. I threw the car in reverse and peeled out of the parking lot as fast as I could. In my rearview mirror, I could see the man standing in the doorway of the motel, watching us drive away. He was still holding that bloody knife, and I swear he was still singing. I borrowed Jake's phone and called 911 as we drove toward the nearest town. The dispatcher said they'd send patrol cars to the motel immediately. We drove straight through to Salt Lake City, neither of us able to sleep or focus on anything except what we'd witnessed. We couldn't even think about our presentation. We were both too traumatized. Later, the police told us that they'd caught the killer. Apparently, he was a serial murderer who'd been on the run for months. He was known for his bizarre behavior of singing children's songs while he stalked his victims. When they found him at the motel, he was sitting outside room 7, our room, still covered in blood, and singing that same lullaby. The strangest part was that he made no attempt to run when the police arrived. He just sat there singing until they handcuffed him. The detectives said he seemed to be waiting for something, though they never figured out what. I still have nightmares about that night. Sometimes I wake up thinking I can hear that horrible singing, and I have to check every room in my house to make sure I'm really alone. Jake and I never traveled together for work again after that. In fact, he quit the company a few months later and moved back to his hometown. He said he couldn't handle being on the road anymore. I don't blame him. Some experiences change you forever, and that night at the Sunset Motor Inn was definitely one of them. My name is Paul Martinez, and what I'm about to tell you happened during the summer of 2016, when I was 25 years old. I had just moved to Phoenix, Arizona, trying to start fresh after a rough breakup back in California. My uncle Roberto owned a small roadside motel called Desert Winds, about 45 minutes outside the city limits on Old Route 60. The place had seen better days, but it was honest work, and he needed someone for the night shift after his last receptionist quit without notice. The job seemed perfect for me at the time. I was trying to save money to go back to school, and working nights meant I could take community college classes during the day. My uncle let me borrow his old pickup truck to get there, and most nights were pretty quiet. Motel mostly served truckers who needed a few hours of sleep, couples looking for privacy, or the occasional traveler who didn't want to pay city prices for a room. I'd been working there for about 6 weeks when everything went sideways. It was a Tuesday night in late August, one of those desert evenings where the heat still radiates off the asphalt even after sunset. The motel was nearly empty, just one room occupied by a middle-aged man who checked in around 11:30 for 3 hours. He seemed normal enough, kept to himself, paid in cash. Miguel, our maintenance guy, was just finishing up his rounds before heading home. He was a good guy, been working for my uncle for years, always made sure I felt safe during those long, lonely nights. As he was leaving, he reminded me to keep the front door locked and only open it when customers arrived. The night started like any other. I had my earbuds in, catching up on a Netflix series on my phone, occasionally glancing up at the empty parking lot through the reception window. The desert can be incredibly quiet at night, not like the city where there's always some kind of background noise. Out there, when it's quiet, it's dead silent. Around 1:15 in the morning, the guest from room 12 came to the front desk to return his key. He was a stocky guy, maybe 45, wearing a blue work shirt and jeans. Seemed tired but friendly enough. I thanked him and wished him a safe drive, watched him walk to his car through the window. His taillights disappeared into the darkness, and I settled back into my show. Maybe 30 minutes later, I noticed someone standing just outside the glass door. At first, I couldn't make out much detail because of the reflection from the fluorescent lights inside, but I could see it was a tall figure, just standing there motionless. I pulled out my earbuds and looked more carefully. The man outside was big, had to be at least 6'4", with a heavy build. He had long, unkempt hair and a thick beard that made his face look almost wild. What struck me immediately was how he was just standing there, not approaching the door, not moving at all, just staring. I walked over to the door but kept it locked. "Can I help you, sir? Are you looking for a room?" He didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge that I'd spoken. He just kept staring at me with these cold, dark eyes. There was something deeply unsettling about his gaze, like he was looking right through me. That's when I noticed his clothes. He was wearing the exact same blue work shirt as the guest who had just left. Not similar, identical. Same brand, same faded stain on the left pocket, same small tear near the collar that I'd noticed earlier. But this man was much taller and broader than the previous guest. My heart started racing. The clothes were too small for him, the shirt stretched tight across his chest, the pants ending well above his ankles. He was barefoot, and I could see dark stains on his hands pressed against the glass. I backed away from the door, my mind trying to process what I was seeing. That's when the phone rang, nearly making me jump out of my skin. It was my Uncle Roberto, and he sounded panicked. "Paul, are you okay? Listen to me carefully. There's been an incident at the state hospital about 10 miles from the motel. A patient escaped earlier tonight. He's extremely dangerous." My throat went dry. What kind of patient? Mental health facility. This guy has a history of violence. The police are searching the area, but they think he might be heading toward the highway. Has anyone unusual come by tonight? I looked toward the door. The man was still there, now pressing his face against the glass, leaving smudges with his nose and mouth. "Uncle Roberto," I whispered, "I think he's here." "What, Paul? If someone's there who doesn't belong, do not let them in. I'm calling 911 right now. Stay on the line with me." The man outside suddenly stepped back from the door and tilted his head, like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. Then he started to smile, not a normal smile, but this wide, unnatural grin that showed too many teeth. He began to laugh, a low chuckling sound that I could hear even through the thick glass. "Paul, are you still there?" My uncle's voice came through the phone. "Yeah, I'm here." I could barely whisper. He's laughing." The man pulled his hands away from the glass, and I could see they were covered in what looked like dried blood. Dark brown stains covered his palms and fingers. He held them up, examining them in the light from the reception area, then began to rub them together like he was washing them. Suddenly, he started to move. Not walking normally, but this strange, jerky dance, swaying back and forth while that horrible laugh continued. He pulled something from his back pocket, a kitchen knife with a long, thin blade that caught the fluorescent light. I dropped behind the front desk, phone still pressed to my ear. "Uncle Roberto, he has a knife. The police are on their way, Paul. Just stay down and stay quiet. Don't do anything to provoke him." Through the window, I could see the man had moved closer to the door again. He was dragging the knife across the glass, not hard enough to break it, but making this awful scraping sound. He kept laughing, sometimes breaking into what sounded like sobbing, then back to laughter again. Minutes felt like hours. The man continued his bizarre behavior, dancing, laughing, crying, all while holding that knife. At one point, he started talking to himself, having what sounded like a conversation with someone who wasn't there. His voice was muffled through the glass, but I could make out fragments, apologies, then angry outbursts, then childlike pleading. Finally, I saw the first police car's headlights in the distance, approaching without sirens or flashing lights. The man outside didn't seem to notice until the officers were almost at the parking lot. When he saw them, his whole demeanor changed. The laughing stopped, and he stood perfectly still for a moment. 4 officers surrounded the building, approaching carefully with their weapons drawn. When they ordered him to drop the knife, he looked directly at me through the window one last time. His expression was almost sad, like he was apologizing for something. Then he charged at the nearest officer. The struggle was brief but violent. The officer managed to avoid the knife, and his partner tackled the man to the ground. There was shouting, the sound of the knife clattering across the asphalt, and then it was over. They cuffed him and put him in the back of one of the patrol cars. One of the officers came to check on me, while the others secured the scene. That's when they told me about what they'd found earlier that evening. The guest who had returned his key, along with a woman who had been with him. They'd been discovered about 2 miles down the highway, in the desert just off the road. The details were too horrible to repeat, but it was clear they'd suffered terribly before dying. Escaped patient had apparently followed them from the motel, waited for them to stop at a rest area, then attacked them both. He'd taken the man's clothes afterward and somehow made his way back to the motel, looking for more victims. I quit that same night. Couldn't even wait until morning. The story made the local news, and business at Desert Winds never recovered. My uncle sold the place about 6 months later to a developer who tore it down and built a gas station. I ended up seeing a therapist for months afterward. The nightmares were the worst part, not just about that night, but about what might have happened if that door hadn't been locked, or if the police had arrived even a few minutes later. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I'm alone at night. How thin the line is between safety and something unthinkable. How quickly an ordinary evening can become the stuff of nightmares. The randomness of it all still haunts me, being in the wrong place at the wrong time, becoming part of someone else's violent story through no fault of your own. That experience changed how I see the world. I'm more careful now, more aware of my surroundings. I never take safety for granted, and I never, ever work nights anymore. A few years back, I had to travel to Denver for a work conference. Usually, I'd fly, but my wife Sarah wanted to come along, and since my company only covered my expenses, we decided to drive instead. After the conference, we planned to stay a few extra days and explore Colorado like tourists. The drive from our home in Kansas City would take about 8 hours, so we planned to make it in one day. But everything that could go wrong did go wrong. We hit construction delays, took a wrong turn that cost us 2 hours, and by the time we were halfway there, it was already past midnight. I was exhausted from driving all day, and Sarah was getting nervous about continuing in the dark. "Let's just find somewhere to stop for the night," she suggested, scanning her phone for nearby hotels. "We can finish the drive tomorrow morning when we're fresh." We'd planned to stay in a nice hotel in Lemon, but we were still 3 hours away, and I could barely keep my eyes open. That's when we spotted the neon sign of the Desert Rose Motel flickering in the distance. It wasn't much to look at, one of those old roadside motels you see scattered across the highways of rural America. But it was exactly what we needed. The parking lot was nearly empty, except for a beat-up pickup truck near the office. Sarah gripped my arm as we walked toward the front desk. "Place gives me the creeps," she whispered. "Are you sure about this?" The motel looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. The paint was peeling, the neon sign buzzed and flickered, and there were only 2 other cars in the entire lot. But I was too tired to care, and honestly, it was our only option for miles. An elderly man with thick glasses greeted us at the front desk. He was friendly enough, though he moved slowly and seemed a bit confused about where he'd put the room keys. "Haven't had many guests lately," he explained apologetically as he fumbled through drawers. "Business has been slow since they built that new highway bypass." Sarah asked if they had a restaurant or at least vending machines, but the old man shook his head. "Just got a snack machine by the ice room," he said. "Has some crackers and candy bars, but that's about it." We thanked him and headed to our room, which was located at the very back of the motel complex. The setting was eerie, nothing but dark desert stretching out behind us, with only the sound of wind and distant coyotes breaking the silence. Our room was basic, but clean enough for the price and the circumstances. Sarah collapsed onto the bed immediately. "I'm exhausted," she said. "Wake me up when we're in Colorado." I decided to take a quick shower before bed. I just started washing my hair when Sarah burst into the bathroom, her eyes wide with alarm. "Carlos, someone's knocking at our door," she whispered urgently. I quickly turned off the water and wrapped a towel around myself. Sure enough, there was a persistent knocking coming from our front door. I walked over and peered through the peephole, but the porch light was too dim to make out who was standing there. "Who is it?" I called out without opening the door. No response. The knocking stopped. Sarah and I exchanged worried glances. Less than a minute later, the knocking resumed, this time more insistent. "What do you want?" I called out again, louder this time. This time, a young male voice answered. "Good evening, sir. I'm from the motel staff. I have fresh towels for your room." I frowned. We hadn't requested any towels, and there were already clean ones in our bathroom. Something felt off about this. "We don't need any towels," I replied. "But thank you." There was no response from the other side of the door. Sarah moved closer to me, her voice barely a whisper. "Don't open it, Carlos. Something's not right." That's when the knocking started again, but this time it was rapid and aggressive, almost violent. Someone was pounding on our door with both fists. "Hey," I shouted. "Back off, or I'm calling the front desk to have them call the police." The pounding stopped, but then we heard something that made my blood run cold, maniacal laughter coming from just outside our door. It was the same voice that had claimed to be motel staff, but now it sounded completely unhinged. Then the voice screamed, "Open the damn door." Sarah started crying and immediately grabbed the phone to call the front desk. The same elderly man who had checked us and answered. "There's someone outside our room trying to break in," Sarah explained, her voice shaking. "He claimed to be your employee, but now he's threatening us." What the old man said next made Sarah's face go pale. "Ma'am, I don't have any male employees," he said slowly. "There's just Betty who does housekeeping during the day, but she goes home at 5. It's just me here at night, and you folks are my only guests." He paused, then continued, "Let me grab my shotgun and come take a look. I'll stay on the phone with you while I walk over." We could hear him moving around, then his footsteps on gravel as he made his way toward our room. After a few minutes, his voice came through the phone. "I'm about 50 yards from your room, and I don't see anyone out here." "But they're still pounding on the door," Sarah exclaimed. "They're yelling at us to open it." "How can you not see them?" "I'm going to come right up to your door so you can see me through the window," he said. Before he could reach us, I made a decision that I immediately regretted. I unlocked the door and yanked it open, ready to confront whoever was terrorizing us. There was no one there. I stepped outside and looked in every direction. The only person I could see was the elderly motel owner walking toward us from across the parking lot, still holding his phone to his ear and carrying an old hunting rifle. When he reached us, he was just as confused as we were. "What exactly happened?" he asked. We told him everything from the beginning: the knocking, the voice claiming to be staff, the threats, the maniacal laughter. He listened carefully, his expression growing more troubled by the minute. "Come with me to the office," he finally said. "I want to show you something." We followed him to the front desk, where he pulled up the security camera footage on an old monitor. The cameras covered the entire front of the motel, including our room's entrance. The footage showed exactly what we'd experienced from the outside perspective. There was no one at our door. The only person visible in any of the recordings was the old man himself, walking toward our room while talking on the phone with Sarah. "I believe you folks," he said quietly. "I think I know what might be happening here." He sat down heavily in his chair and rubbed his temples. "About 6 months ago, we had a terrible incident. Some gang members killed a young man in room 12, that's 2 doors down from where you're staying. They beat him to death and left his body on the bed. I didn't find him until the next morning when Betty went to clean the room." Sarah grabbed my hand tightly. "The police reviewed our security footage from that night," he continued. "Multiple men were involved, but we never got a clear view of their faces. They were never caught. I don't rent out room 12 anymore, haven't since it happened." He looked up at us with sad, tired eyes. "I think maybe the spirit of that poor boy was trying to get your attention. Maybe he's still looking for help, or maybe he's trying to warn people about this place." Sarah and I thanked the old man for his honesty and his help, but we told him we'd prefer to drive on to Denver that night. He understood completely and even offered to escort us to our car. "I'm real sorry about all this," he said as we loaded our luggage. "I know it's not much consolation, but you're not the first guests to experience something like this." As we drove away, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see a figure standing in the motel parking lot watching us leave. But there was nothing except the flickering neon sign growing smaller in the distance. We drove straight through to Denver that night, taking turns at the wheel when one of us got tired. Neither of us spoke much about what had happened, but I know we were both thinking the same thing. Some places hold on to their tragedies, and the Desert Rose Motel was definitely one of them. To this day, when we travel by car, we stick to major hotel chains in well-populated areas. Some people might call us paranoid, but after that night, we learned that the cheapest option isn't always worth the risk. This happened to us a few years ago when my girlfriend and I decided to take a short road trip. We like driving at night because there's less traffic and the scenery is more peaceful. We were on a state highway, far from the city, and although the road was lonely, it didn't feel dangerous. After several hours of driving, fatigue began to set in, and we decided to look for a place to rest. We weren't near any city, but after a few minutes, we saw the lights of a roadside motel. At first glance, it seemed like a good place to spend the night. The place was called the Stardust Motor Inn, and it sat along a stretch of Route 66 that time had forgotten. From the distance, the place looked full. There were several cars in the parking lot, but what seemed strange to us was that they were all vintage cars, like from the 1950s. At first I thought maybe it was a classic car meetup or something similar. But my girlfriend pointed out that, in addition to the vehicles, you could also hear music from that era coming from a small event hall next to the motel. The cars were immaculate: a cherry red Chevrolet Bel Air, a mint green Cadillac Eldorado, a powder blue Ford Thunderbird, and at least a dozen others, all perfectly restored and gleaming under the parking lot lights. They were arranged in neat rows, like they were on display at a car show. But there was something almost too perfect about them, like they had just rolled off the assembly line. The entire place was lit up, and although we couldn't see anyone, the atmosphere was that of a party in full swing. Laughter, murmurs, background music. There was no doubt that the site was in operation and packed with people. The music drifting from the event hall was pure 1950s, Elvis, Chuck Berry, Buddy Holly, all the classics. But it wasn't coming from speakers or a sound system. It sounded live, like there was actually a band performing inside. We could hear the distinct sound of a saxophone, the twang of an electric guitar, and vocals that seemed to echo with the authentic energy of the era. We stayed a few minutes in front of the entrance, wondering whether to ask for a room or not. But between the number of cars and the noise from the party, it was most likely that the motel was full, and that, even if we found a place, we wouldn't be able to rest with so much noise. We decided to move on and look for another place. The trip went smoothly, and days later, when we were on our way back, we passed the same highway. It was early morning, and the road was even more deserted than the previous time. We knew we were going to pass the motel again. So out of pure curiosity, we decided to look and see if it was still as full. But what we saw forced us to brake suddenly. The motel was there, but it wasn't the same one we had seen. The structure was the same, but everything was dark and in ruins. The lights that once illuminated the facade were no longer there. The parking lot was empty, and worst of all, the event hall, where the music and laughter could be heard, was now just an old building without windows, with partially collapsed walls. We got out of the car without saying anything, walked a few steps to the entrance, and stood in silence, trying to understand what we were seeing. There were no traces of the party. There were no vintage cars. There was absolutely nothing. It was as if everything we saw days before had never existed. I felt a chill run down my back and looked at my girlfriend, who was completely pale. Without needing to say anything to each other, we both knew that the best thing was to get out of there as soon as possible. On the way back, we didn't talk much about it, but the uneasiness accompanied us throughout the journey. It was impossible that we had been confused about the place. It was the same road, the same location, the same motel structure. But the state it was in didn't match what we had seen before. When we got home, my girlfriend started looking for information about the motel on the internet. There wasn't much recent information, but after a while, she found an old image of the place. It was exactly as we remembered it the first time. The lights on, the parking lot full of vintage cars, the event hall. Everything looked the same. But when reviewing the description of the image, our blood ran cold. Photograph of the Stardust Motor Inn during its grand reopening celebration. October 15th, 1958, the night of the tragedy. My girlfriend dropped the phone and looked at me with her eyes wide open. I couldn't process what I was reading. We searched for more information and found an article from an old newspaper. It said that, on October 15th, 1958, a tragedy occurred at that place. The motel was celebrating its grand reopening after renovations with a big party in the event hall. Local residents, travelers, and car enthusiasts had gathered to celebrate with live music, dancing, and festivities that were supposed to last all night. But around midnight, a gas leak in the kitchen caused a massive explosion that engulfed both the event hall and half of the motel in flames. The fire spread so quickly that most people couldn't escape. 27 people died that night, trapped in the inferno while the band played on, unaware of the danger until it was too late. The article described how the vintage cars in the parking lot became tombstones of twisted metal, their owners never making it out to drive them home. The Stardust Motor Inn was completely destroyed and never rebuilt. The land was purchased by the state and left abandoned, becoming a forgotten monument to that terrible night. But then, what was it that we saw that night? Whose voices did we hear? How was it possible that the motel had come to life again, as if the tragedy had never happened? The more we researched, the more disturbing details we found. Witnesses from 1958 described the same scene we had witnessed. The perfectly arranged vintage cars, the live music echoing from the event hall, the laughter and conversation of party-goers, enjoying what was supposed to be a night of celebration. My girlfriend refused to talk about the subject after that. She threw away the printouts and closed the computer. But I stayed there, unable to look away from the screen, reading the names of the deceased, trying to find some kind of logical explanation. But there wasn't one. The final piece of the puzzle came when I found a local historian's blog post about the tragedy. He mentioned that over the decades, several travelers had reported seeing the Stardust alive again on the anniversary of the fire. Always the same scene, the vintage cars, the music, the celebration frozen in time, playing out the last moments before disaster struck. According to local legend, the souls of those who died that night were so caught up in the joy of the celebration that they never realized what had happened to them. They continue their eternal party, welcoming travelers to join them, unaware that they're inviting the living into a world of the dead. I don't know what happened to us that night on the highway. I don't know if it was an illusion, a trick of our minds, or if, somehow that I don't understand, for a few minutes we entered a moment from the past that never stopped repeating itself. All I know is that every time I think about it, I'm filled with a sense of emptiness. Something that tells me we shouldn't have seen what we saw, that we shouldn't have been there. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we had stopped that night, if we had gone inside and joined the celebration. Would we have become part of it forever, trapped in that endless loop of 1958? Or would we have simply vanished, like so many other travelers who may have been lured in by the lights and music and never made it home? I guess I'll never know, and maybe that's for the best. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Some doors are meant to stay closed, and some parties are meant for the dead alone. My name is Rachel, and I can't forget what happened that night. I'm a 40-year-old woman with a love for road trips and visiting family whenever I can. Normally, these trips are filled with laughter, stories, and a feeling of coming home. But this one was different. It's a story I need to share, not just to clear my mind, but to remind others of the unexpected dangers that can lurk in the most ordinary places. It all started on a long drive home after a wonderful vacation at my sister's house in Colorado. My elderly mother was with me. Her spirit was still as youthful as ever despite her age of 78. We had shared memories and stories during the journey, but as the hours passed, fatigue began to weigh on us. We decided to look for a place to rest for the night, a roadside motel that at first glance seemed harmless, at least to an inexperienced eye. The Desert Rose Motel sat like a forgotten relic against the Nevada landscape, its pink stucco walls faded by decades of sun and wind. The vacancy sign buzzed with a dying fluorescent bulb, and only 3 other cars dotted the expansive parking lot. It was the kind of place that had probably seen better days in the 1960s, when road trips were romantic adventures rather than necessary evils. When we entered the room, I felt it immediately, a strange and heavy atmosphere, like when you have that sixth sense that someone is watching you from somewhere. It's hard to explain, but it was as if the walls were observing us. I attributed it to exhaustion and let it pass. After all, we would only be there to sleep and continue on our way in the morning. The room itself was a study in outdated decor. Avocado green carpet that had seen better decades, wood paneling that screamed 1970s, and a musty smell that no amount of air freshener could quite mask. The beds were covered in comforters, with a pattern that might have been fashionable when Nixon was president. While my mother showered, I sat on the bed checking my phone, trying to distract myself. But that unsettling feeling wouldn't go away. It remained there, like a persistent itch at the back of my mind. I tried to ignore it, focusing on trivial social media updates, but the unease was impossible to dispel. Eventually, exhaustion overcame me, and I managed to fall asleep. However, my sleep was far from peaceful. Hours later, I woke up suddenly to the sound of creaking wood. My first thought was that it might be rats, but the noise was too deliberate. It sounded like someone or something was moving above us. I covered myself with the blanket, hoping to muffle both the noise and my growing panic. But then, a loud thud echoed in the room, and I jumped up. My heart was beating hard as my mother and I looked at each other, our eyes wide with fear. And then, from one second to the next, the terror began. A man standing in the corner of the room. His silhouette was barely visible in the darkness. He looked like something out of a nightmare. Disheveled, dirty, and with a nauseating stench of rot and unwashed flesh that seemed to fill the entire room. But there was something else, something that made it even worse. His clothes were decades old, moth-eaten and hanging in tatters. His hair was long and matted, and his fingernails had grown into yellowed claws. Most disturbing of all were his eyes. They reflected light like an animal's, and they never seemed to blink. We screamed, a heart-wrenching sound that filled the room. The man advanced toward us, and panic took hold of me. I fought against him, letting myself be carried away by instinct while my mother remained paralyzed, her eyes filled with terror. I struggled against his grip with all my strength, desperate but determined. His strength was surprising, but I don't know if it was adrenaline or fear that gave me power. His breath was hot and rancid against my face as we struggled. Up close, I could see that his skin was pale and waxy, like someone who hadn't seen sunlight in years. There were sores on his arms and face, and his teeth were black and broken. Whatever this man had become, he had been living like an animal for far too long. Suddenly, we received unexpected help, thank God. The couple from the adjacent room heard our screams. The man shouted from outside asking if everything was okay, and my mother begged for help while opening the door. This man entered immediately, and realizing what was happening, lunged at the intruder with such force that both fell to the floor. Meanwhile, his girlfriend had already called the police and the motel manager, who arrived moments later, equally shocked by the situation. When the police arrived, a chilling story began to unfold. Above our room, hidden in a narrow space in the attic, was the intruder's refuge. No one knew it existed. They discovered he had been living there for what appeared to be months, spying on guests through small openings in the ceiling. The place was a grotesque nest of food wrappers, dirty blankets, and the disgusting stench of human waste. But that wasn't the worst part. The officer who led the investigation found something that made even his seasoned stomach turn. The man had been keeping trophies, personal items stolen from previous guests. Jewelry, wallets, photographs, even articles of clothing. Some of these items belonged to people who had been reported missing over the past 2 years. The police discovered that he had been selecting his victims carefully. Young women traveling alone, elderly couples, families with small children, anyone who seemed vulnerable. He would watch them for hours through the ceiling, learning their routines, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. We had been lucky that the couple next door was still awake and alert. Knowing that he had been watching us, possibly for hours before deciding to attack, sent a deep chill through my bones. How long had he been there, unnoticed, lurking in the shadows of that forgotten space? It was a question with no comforting answer. The investigation revealed that the motel manager had been completely unaware of the situation. The attic space wasn't even on the building's original blueprints. It was a crawl space that had been modified and expanded over time. The intruder had likely gained access through a maintenance panel on the roof and had been living there, undetected, feeding off vending machines and whatever he could steal from guests. The police took him away, and we were left dealing with the aftermath. That night changed something in me. The world felt different, and not in a way that's easy to describe. It was as if the veil of security under which we live had been torn, revealing a darkness that was all too real. I still think about that room, wondering if anyone else felt the same chill when staying there. I wonder if they also perceived that hidden gaze from somewhere above. But most of all, I wonder about the man. What led him to live in that hideout above unsuspecting guests? It's a question that haunts me, just like the memory of that night. The motel was shut down permanently within a week of the incident. The owner claimed he had no knowledge of what had been happening, but the lawsuit from the families of the missing persons suggested otherwise. The building was demolished 6 months later, but sometimes I drive past that empty lot and still feel a chill. So if you ever find yourself in a motel room and an inexplicable shiver runs down your back, trust your instincts. Sometimes the things we can't see are the most dangerous of all, and they're not always ghosts. That's a lesson learned the hard way, a warning from someone who lived through it and survived to tell about it. Stay alert, stay safe, and remember, sometimes the monsters aren't under the bed. They can be above you, watching, waiting, planning. And always remember to look up. Three years ago, my wife Linda, our 9-year-old daughter Emma, and I were driving from Houston to visit my brother in Albuquerque. We'd planned to make the trip in one day, but a series of delays, traffic jams, a flat tire, and construction zones put us way behind schedule. By the time we reached the Texas-New Mexico border, it was already getting dark, and Linda was getting nervous about continuing the drive at night. Those who know the highways in this part of the country understand that traveling after dark can be dangerous, especially on the more remote stretches. "Let's find somewhere to stay for the night," Linda suggested. "We can finish the drive tomorrow morning when it's light." It was almost 10 o'clock when we finally spotted the neon sign of the Cactus Creek Motel flickering in the distance. It wasn't much to look at, just another one of those roadside motels you find scattered across the Southwest. But it was the only option for miles. The parking lot was nearly empty except for 2 other vehicles. We couldn't tell if they belonged to guests or employees, but we were too tired to care. We just needed a place to sleep. I practically fell onto the bed as soon as we got to our room. The drive had been exhausting, and I was asleep within minutes. Linda lay down too, but she's always been a light sleeper, especially in unfamiliar places. Emma, on the other hand, stayed up playing games on her tablet. At 9 years old, she was used to staying up late on weekends. I have no idea how long I'd been asleep when Emma woke me up. It was still dark outside, and according to the clock on the nightstand, it was almost 2 in the morning. "Dad," she whispered, shaking my shoulder. "Someone's looking through the back window." I sat up groggily. "What, are you sure?" "Yes," she said, her voice steady but concerned. "I was playing my game when I saw a shadow move past the window. Someone was standing there for a long time, just watching. I got up and went to the window that faced the back of the motel. I pulled the curtain aside slightly and peered out, but it was too dark to see anything clearly. There was nothing but desert scrubland stretching out behind the building." "I don't see anyone, honey," I told Emma. "Maybe it was just a tree branch moving in the wind." "Dad, there aren't any trees back there," she said. "And it wasn't a branch, it was a person." I pulled the curtain closed and sat on the edge of her bed. "Well, whoever it was, they're gone now. Try to get some sleep, okay?" I was just dozing off again when Linda shook me awake. "Jorge, wake up," she whispered urgently. "I just saw 2 people looking through the window. They were standing right there for several minutes." I was getting angry now. The idea that some locals might be peeping on tourists was infuriating. I got dressed quickly and headed for the door. "I'm going to the front desk to complain," I told Linda. "This is completely unacceptable." The night clerk was a middle-aged woman who seemed genuinely concerned when I explained what was happening. "Sir, I'm really sorry to hear about this," she said. "But I have to tell you, you're the only guests we have tonight. It's just me and Tommy here." She gestured to a young man, probably in his early 20s, who was restocking snacks behind the counter. "Well, someone's been spying on my family," I insisted, "and I want to know who it is." Tommy volunteered to come investigate with me. He grabbed a flashlight from behind the counter, and I followed him outside. The kid looked nervous, and I didn't blame him. He was young and probably didn't have much experience dealing with this kind of situation. We walked around to the back of the motel, where our room was located. Tommy shined his flashlight around the area, but we didn't see anyone. "Maybe they ran off into the desert when they heard us coming," I suggested. "Could be," Tommy said. "Let me check a little further out." We walked about 50 yards behind the motel, where the desert vegetation got thicker. That's when we started to smell it, a horrible, nauseating stench that got worse the further we went. "Jesus, what is that smell?" Tommy gagged. "Smelled something like it once before, when a neighbor's dog had died under our deck, and we didn't find it for a week. But this was much, much worse." "It's probably a dead animal," I said, though I was starting to have a terrible feeling that it was something else entirely. We followed the smell deeper into the scrubland, covering our noses with our shirts. Tommy's flashlight beam swept back and forth across the ground, until it illuminated something that made us both stop dead in our tracks. There, in a natural depression in the ground, was what could only be described as a mass grave. Bodies were piled on top of each other, some more decomposed than others. The sight was so horrifying that Tommy immediately turned away and vomited. I stood there in shock for what felt like an eternity, trying to process what I was seeing. There had to be at least a dozen corpses in various stages of decay. Some looked like they'd been there for months, while others appeared more recent. When I finally came to my senses, I grabbed Tommy's arm and we ran back toward the motel. He was crying and shaking by the time we reached the front desk. "Call the police," I told the woman at the counter. "Call them right now," but she shook her head frantically. "We can't," she said. "If Mr. Morrison finds out we called the cops, he'll kill us too. He owns this place and I think he's involved in this." Tommy nodded through his tears. "She's right. Morrison's been acting strange lately and he's always out there in the desert at night. We thought he was just checking the property, but now..." I didn't wait to hear the rest. I ran to our room, woke up Linda and Emma, and told them to pack immediately. "We're leaving right now," I said. "Don't ask questions, just get in the car." Linda could see the panic in my eyes and didn't argue. Within 10 minutes, we were driving away from the Cactus Creek Motel as fast as legally possible. I waited until we were about an hour down the road before I told Linda what Tommy and I had discovered. I made sure Emma was asleep in the back seat before I explained about the mass grave. Our vacation was ruined. Even after we reached my brother's house in Albuquerque, I couldn't get those images out of my head. Linda and I barely spoke for the rest of the trip, and I could tell she was struggling with what I told her. When we got back home, I called the FBI and reported what we'd found. I gave them the exact location and described everything we'd seen. They said they'd investigate immediately. A few weeks later, I saw a news report about a major drug cartel operation that had been busted in that area. The report mentioned that authorities had discovered a mass burial site containing the remains of 16 people, most of whom were believed to be witnesses or rivals who had crossed the cartel. The owner of the Cactus Creek Motel was arrested and charged with multiple counts of accessory to murder. Apparently, he'd been allowing the cartel to use his property as a dumping ground in exchange for protection money. Looking back, I'm convinced that whoever Emma and Linda saw looking through our window were the spirits of some of those poor victims. Maybe they were trying to lead us to their bodies so they could finally be found and given proper burials. I'll never know for sure, but I'm grateful that we discovered the truth and that those families finally got some closure. It doesn't make the nightmares any easier to deal with, but at least some good came out of that horrible night. We don't take road trips anymore. When we travel now, we fly, and we stay in well-reviewed hotels in populated areas. Some experiences change your perspective on the world forever, and that night at the Cactus Creek Motel was definitely one of them. My name is Michael, and I'm just an ordinary guy with a regular 9-to-5 office job that takes me on business trips more often than I'd like. I've always enjoyed sharing stories, and what I'm about to tell you is an experience that still haunts me to this day. Something I never thought I'd encounter in real life. A night that, no matter how hard I try, I can't forget. It was just another business trip, one of those late-night drives where the highway stretches endlessly in front of you, barely illuminated by the dim glow of headlights. I was tired, but the thought of a good night's sleep kept me going. Around 1 a.m, I finally stopped at a roadside motel. One of those lonely places where the neon sign flickers like a beacon in the darkness. The parking lot was empty, which was actually a relief. There wouldn't be any noisy neighbors to interrupt my rest. I checked in, grabbed my key, and settled into the room. After a quick shower, I sat on the bed with some gas station food and the low murmur of the television as my only company. By 3 in the morning, exhaustion finally caught up with me. I turned off the TV, got under the covers, and prepared to sleep. I was just drifting off when I heard noises outside. They weren't the usual sounds of traffic, but voices, people walking and talking in the quiet of the night. I've always been a light sleeper, so it was hard to ignore. Frustration got me out of bed, and I thought a cigarette might help me relax enough to get back to sleep. The night air was cool against my skin as I exhaled the smoke and watched it dissipate into the darkness. That's when I saw them, 2 figures wrapped in red cloaks gliding through a side door, right next to a warehouse adjacent to the motel. Curiosity immediately piqued. With careful steps, I approached silently, trying to figure out what was happening. As I got closer, I heard something that chilled my blood. Voices chanting in a language I couldn't identify. The sound was rhythmic but disturbing, like a dark melody that tugged at something deep inside me. At that moment, I knew something was very, very wrong. Rounding the corner of the building, I found a window. I leaned in cautiously and looked inside, and at that moment my heart stopped for a second. In the dimly lit interior, there was a group of people, all dressed in red cloaks standing in a circle. They held hands, their voices rising and falling in a strange, chilling rhythm. I strained to see what was in the center of the circle. And that's when I heard it, a scream, sharp, desperate, cutting through the air like a razor. But it wasn't just any scream. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could make out what appeared to be a stone altar in the center of their circle. The metallic smell of blood seemed to seep through the glass, and I realized with growing horror that I was witnessing something far more sinister than I could have imagined. The chanting grew louder, more urgent, and I saw one of the robed figures raise what looked like a curved blade that gleamed in the candlelight. I turned and ran. My feet pounded the ground hard, adrenaline propelling me with every step. I barely made it to my room, grabbed the keys with shaking hands, and tried to start the car. The engine roared, breaking the silence of the night, until the figures came out of the building and started running toward me. But fear is a great motivator. I floored the accelerator, shot out of the parking lot, and watched the figures fade into the distance in the rearview mirror. I drove for miles, my heart pounding hard, until I finally felt safe enough to stop and call the police. The authorities responded quickly and sent units to the scene. But when they arrived, no one was there. What they found inside was terrifying. Skeletal remains scattered across the floor, wooden figures with satanic symbols carved into them, ancient books with occult texts, and bloodstains everywhere. Evidence of rituals and sacrifices, both human and animal. The warehouse had been converted into some kind of ceremonial chamber, with symbols painted on the walls, and what appeared to be a well-used sacrificial altar made of blackened stone. They never found any suspects, nor the owner of the motel, because according to records, the property was still in the name of a man who had died more than 7 years ago. The police took control of the site and shut it down, as the investigation revealed it had been the scene of multiple crimes. They even had a theory that the cult used unsuspecting motel guests for their rituals. The detective who interviewed me mentioned that they'd found personal belongings from at least 12 different people hidden in the warehouse: wallets, jewelry, clothing, all from travelers who had simply vanished while passing through this remote stretch of highway. The most disturbing part was that some of these items dated back over a decade, suggesting this had been going on for years. I still think about that night, how close I came to becoming part of something dark and unimaginable. It's a story I never thought I'd live to tell, but here I am, sharing it now. Be careful on the road, and never ignore that feeling in your gut that tells you something isn't right. Sometimes that instinct is the only thing standing between you and becoming another missing person on a police report. The motel was demolished 6 months later, but sometimes I wonder if there are other places like it out there. Other lonely stops along forgotten highways where travelers disappear into the darkness. I've changed my route for business trips now, and I never stay at motels that seem too isolated or too empty. Trust your instincts. They might just save your life. I want to share my story anonymously because it involves something delicate, and I'm not looking to become famous by telling this. On the contrary, when all of this happened, I never wanted to give interviews or have my name publicized because my family's safety and privacy are the most important things to me. But I think it's appropriate to share this story so that people will always be careful and suspicious of everything in general, to be more cautious. This happened several years ago when the platform wasn't as well known as it is now. I was younger then and frequently had to travel out of state or even out of the country to give courses and consultations for the company I worked for at that time. My wife often accompanied me on these trips, but because she was pregnant with our first child at the time, she decided it would be better to stay at her mother's house so she could take care of her. I decided to travel with my dog, Rocky, because my mother-in-law is allergic, and my wife couldn't take him to her mother's house. I always rented apartments through this platform, and of course, the company covered the expenses. I had never had any problems until that particular trip. To begin with, I made the serious mistake of renting an Airbnb where the host had no reviews. I decided to book it anyway because I had done that before and everything had always worked out perfectly. I had never had any problems with the places or the hosts, so I decided to give him a chance. Besides, it was the only one that accepted pets and was close to where I needed to work. That day, I arrived in the afternoon at the location, a small one-story apartment that looked very cozy at first glance. It had a backyard that was perfect for my dog to go out and play a little and take care of his needs. The host left me a message telling me where the keys were. I never saw him in person because he wasn't there when I arrived, nor did he come to the apartment at any point. He only gave me instructions through the platform's chat feature. To be honest, he wasn't very friendly, but he wasn't rude either. He simply limited himself to giving me instructions about the place, and that was it. He wasn't like some hosts who offer to answer questions or make themselves available in case there are any problems. But that wasn't a problem for me. I didn't see it as something bad. I simply thought he was someone who limited himself to doing his job. Everything started the first night when I let my dog out to the backyard for the first time so he could take care of his needs before going to sleep. I should mention that from the moment we arrived, he positioned himself behind the door that led to the patio and wouldn't move from there. He was scratching at the door for me to open it, but I didn't have time to be watching him in the patio, so I never opened it until that night. When I opened the door, he ran out to the patio at full speed and started barking very desperately. He was also whimpering at the same time, as if he wanted me to pay attention to something. This struck me as very strange, but I didn't give it much importance. To be honest, even though he had never acted like this before, I had no choice but to bring him back inside because I didn't want to bother the neighbors, if there were any, since most of the apartments nearby were for sale. When I brought my dog inside, he was desperate to go back out. He stood there behind the door that led to the back patio, scratching and barking, so I had no option but to put him to sleep in his travel crate that I used to transport him with me. All night he was very restless and barely let me sleep. He was whimpering and barking, wanting to get out. I didn't know what was happening to him. He had never done this before because he was always a very calm dog. Besides, he was well trained. But there was something that was making him extremely anxious, enough for him to react that way, and I didn't know why. The next day, I went to work, but left my dog locked inside the apartment for a couple of hours, so he couldn't go out to the patio and bark like he had done all night. When I returned, I took him out to the street to give him space and let him take care of his needs, because I was no longer willing to take him to that back patio that seemed to disturb him so much. Hours passed and I lay down on the bed to sleep, but that night, while I was sleeping, I heard someone crying outside in the back patio. It was so clear that it woke me up immediately. Rocky started barking again, facing the bedroom window that looked out toward that patio. I opened the curtains just slightly to look out and check if someone was back there, thinking that maybe someone had broken in. But there was nobody there. I was certain of what I had heard, and my dog's barking confirmed it for me. It took a long time for my dog to calm down so I could get back to sleep. So I went to work, sleep-deprived the next day. That day was the last day I would be in that city. I was already looking forward to going home because I no longer felt comfortable in that place after everything that had happened. But fate played against me, ensuring that everything I'm about to tell you would happen precisely while I was staying there. It was around 11 at night. I was sleeping peacefully, and my dog was too, when suddenly I heard someone knocking very loudly on the door. I woke up immediately and looked out the window that was next to the front door. I could see many lights and 3 police officers standing outside. I immediately opened the door, asking what was happening. They asked me what I was doing in that place. I told them that I had rented an apartment for 3 days and showed them my phone so they could confirm what I was saying on the app. After verifying everything, they told me they were sorry that I had to experience this, but they needed to evacuate the place because they had a search warrant. They told me, in other words, that the owner of the place was accused of killing several people, and that they had to search the place to verify this before the man could escape. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. All of this hit me like a bucket of cold water. While I was listening to all of this, I felt like I was in a dream, or rather, in a nightmare, as if it weren't real. I couldn't believe this was happening to me, but unfortunately, it was very real. So I quickly started gathering my things and left the place with my dog. Before leaving, I told the officers that my dog had been barking toward the back patio the entire time, and I didn't know if that might help them in any way, but I felt the need to tell them. It turned out that the guy had buried at least 7 people in that patio. They were all skeletal remains by then. It was a serial killer from that area, who they had been looking for a long time because he had the same modus operandi. The guy was a wealthy, very intelligent man, according to the criminologists who worked the case. Nobody suspected him. I learned all of this because after it happened, I became obsessed with his case. I wanted to know everything about him and what he had done because I still couldn't believe that I had stayed in that place where he buried his victims. Even to this day, I still can't believe it. He confessed that he rented out the place precisely, so there would always be activity there, and nobody would suspect what was buried in that location. This experience definitely marked my life and made me very paranoid. Always remember to be cautious, because there are many psychopaths out there who are free. I'm sending this message to share our terrible experience that happened during a vacation I took with my family. I hope you can share it. My name is Claudia Ruiz, and I'm from Phoenix, Arizona. This happened a little over a year ago when my husband, my 2 teenage children, and I went on vacation to Montreal, Canada, in the fall. We were very excited because we had been planning this trip for a year in advance. I was counting down the days until the date we would leave to see that beautiful country. We didn't stay in a hotel. We decided to rent an Airbnb because it was more comfortable and also more economical. We rented an apartment that was in an area with a lot of construction around it. In fact, we had no neighbors because all the other apartments were still being built. Some were almost finished, and you could see it would become a new apartment complex. Behind us was just forest, which was very beautiful, by the way, thanks to the autumn leaves in warm colors falling from the trees. The woman who rented us the apartment was also a Mexican woman who mentioned in her platform profile that she had been living in that country for more than 15 years. She spoke English, French, and of course Spanish. I have to say that she was very kind to me throughout our interaction. Before the trip, she answered all my questions and let me know that she could help us with whatever we needed once we were there. When the day finally arrived, we reached that beautiful country. The truth is that we spent the entire day out in the rental car, and we arrived at the apartment after 11 at night. She had sent me a message before 3 in the afternoon, which was the time when we could check into the place. But I didn't see the message until we arrived because we spent the whole day exploring the city, and I didn't check anyone's messages. In this message, she welcomed us, followed by the list of house rules and guidelines. But at the end, she left me a message saying that her daughter lived in the basement of that apartment. I should mention that in Canada, it's common for people to live in basements and have their own entrance. She told me not to worry, that we would never run into her because she had her own entrance, but she wanted to let me know so we wouldn't be startled if we heard anything. Well, I wasn't going to let that ruin our vacation, so I just replied thanking her for letting me know. We were very tired, so my husband and I stayed in the master bedroom and my children in the adjacent one. They're 2 young kids who were 12 and 14 years old at the time. I remember that I fell asleep almost immediately. The flight and the day of walking left me completely exhausted. I didn't know anything about myself until around 3:30 in the morning when some noises woke me up coming from downstairs in the basement. It sounded like someone was dragging a chair or something similar. The sound was very loud. You could also hear someone walking, footsteps on the wooden floor that the condominium had. This seemed somewhat strange to me because of the late hour. I figured it was the host's daughter, but it didn't seem right for her to make so much noise at those hours, knowing there were guests upstairs. That night, it seemed rather inconsiderate to me. My husband was fast asleep, and I didn't want to wake him, but I had trouble getting back to sleep because the noises didn't stop. This went on for about an hour until they finally ceased, and I was able to sleep. The next morning, the first thing my children said to me when I came out of the bedroom was whether I had heard the noises from the night before. I told them yes, that they had woken me up. My husband laughed, saying he hadn't heard or felt anything. He was sound asleep. But I was somewhat annoyed by what had happened. So I told him to send a message to the owner to tell her what had occurred. And maybe she could talk to her daughter about not making so much noise at night since it had woken us up. My husband is very shy and doesn't like getting into conflicts, so he asked me not to say anything. But I sent the message anyway. That day we went out and spent the day as tourists. In the morning, while we were in a coffee shop taking shelter from the cold outside, the owner responded to my message, apologizing for what had happened the night before. She told me something that seemed very strange to me. She wrote that sometimes her daughter didn't like having other people with her in the house, but she reiterated that she would talk to her so it wouldn't happen again. I didn't know whether to thank her or what to respond to that, because if she didn't like it, why did she live there? Or why did the woman rent out the place? That was the first thing that came to mind. But anyway, I continued with my day and didn't let anything ruin my trip. We arrived at the condominium very late, almost midnight. My children went straight to sleep. My husband and I stayed in the living room for a while to drink some wine we had bought at a local store. We were drinking and talking when suddenly those noises started again from the basement, very intense. But this time, they sounded more like banging. It was very strange. It seemed like someone was hitting the wall or the floor. I no longer knew what to think. My husband and I looked at each other in silence, because those were no longer normal sounds of someone simply walking around their house or moving a chair. So I immediately sent another message to the owner to let her know, but she never replied. My husband asked me if he should go down to listen directly outside the basement door. Maybe the woman living there needed help or something. I told him yes, but that I would accompany him because I didn't want to leave him alone. We went down to a room that was still part of our space, but was very dark. Past that room was a small hallway where the basement door was located at the end. My husband tried to turn on the light in that room, but it wouldn't turn on. So I turned on my phone's flashlight, and my husband turned on his. I should mention that the noises continued, and when we finally reached the door, we looked down and saw that the light was off. The woman was in complete darkness. At that point, my husband knocked on her door, saying that we were her mother's guests, and then asked if she was okay. But nobody responded, and the noises stopped the second my husband finished speaking. We were left in complete silence, and the situation became very tense. I no longer wanted to be there. I felt a very strange vibe and just wanted to go back upstairs. My husband insisted again, but there was no response, so I told him we should go upstairs, and that's what we did. I sent another message to the owner, but she still didn't respond. So I decided to call the number she had given me. She told me to excuse her for not responding, but that she was already sleeping. I responded, embarrassed for having woken her up. but I had to let her know what we had heard because we had been worried about her daughter, since those banging sounds weren't like the ones from the night before. They weren't normal. She responded with a strange laugh, somewhat nervous, abnormal for a mother who's being told her daughter might be in danger. She simply replied, "I already told you not to worry. She's like that. She has trouble adapting to new people. That's all." I honestly didn't know what to say in response. It was such an abnormal answer. I just told her it was okay and apologized for having woken her up. After that, she said goodbye and hung up. My husband and I had no idea what was happening. We decided it was better to go to sleep because it had been a very long day. But that same night, around 4 in the morning, one of my children came into our bedroom, somewhat frightened. He woke us up, telling us he had seen a woman at the edge of his bedroom door. You couldn't see who it was because it was dark, but she had long hair and was very pale, and it had scared him a lot. It was my younger son, and he almost always had nightmares. So unfortunately, my husband and I didn't take what he was telling us seriously. His father quickly went out to verify that everything was okay, but he found nobody, and my other son was sleeping peacefully. All we did was calm my son down. We told him it had been another nightmare, but that everything was fine. But he swore to me that it hadn't been a nightmare. He said he had heard his door open with a creaking sound, and when it opened completely, he saw that woman standing there. He told me it scared him a lot, and he decided not to move or do anything. The woman had stayed there for a while watching them, and then left slowly. I did worry because he said it with such certainty, very sure of what he was talking about, but above all, he was scared. That night he stayed with us, and I held him until he fell asleep. The next day, my younger son wouldn't stop talking about what he had seen the night before. My older son was making fun of him, calling him a scaredy cat and things like that. But of course, I put a stop to that. I also talked to my younger son to tell him to enjoy the trip and stop talking about it. But now I know I did wrong. Night fell and we returned to that place. This time we arrived earlier because I had felt sick that day with stomach pain, probably from something that didn't agree with me, so I went to bed early. My husband stayed with my children in the living room watching a series. But then he joined me in our bedroom and told me that our children had stayed watching TV in the living room a little longer. I told him that was fine and tried to sleep. But not even an hour had passed when my younger son came running into our bedroom again. This time, he was telling us that we had to go with him, that his older brother was downstairs in the basement, and that they had discovered something. We immediately put on our sandals and ran downstairs. We turned on our phone flashlights and called out to our older son in low voices because we couldn't see him. My other son told us that his brother was behind the basement door. My husband opened it immediately, and there was my older son, standing in front of what appeared to be an altar where there was only a lit candle in this large room. There was nothing else, no furniture, no light, just that altar. When we approached, we saw an urn, and when we opened it, we saw that it contained ashes. At the top of the altar was a photo of a young pale woman with long, straight black hair, and around it were many crosses and religious items. My younger son pointed to the photograph and told us that was the woman who had come to look into their room the night before. A chill ran through my entire body. I took both my children by the hand and got them out of that place immediately. It was evident that nobody lived there. And it was also obvious that those ashes belonged to the woman in the photo, who we later confirmed was the owner's daughter who had died some time ago. We knew this because that same night I called her to demand an explanation, while my husband and my children packed our suitcases to leave that place. She spoke to me in an embarrassed voice and then started crying, saying that her daughter lived there, that she couldn't take her out of what had been her room for years. That's why she had put her ashes there, and she manifested at night. That's why the noises were heard. She said it so matter-of-factly that I knew this woman wasn't mentally well. It gave me chills to talk to her. My mistake was having rented that place that had no reviews. I let myself be influenced by the image of a kind woman who was also from my country. But I never imagined that something like this would happen to us. I filed my complaint on the platform, and they deactivated that woman's account. And they reimbursed me for the nights we didn't stay there, because I had rented it for a full week. Those 3 nights we slept next to a ghost, next to the ashes of a woman we didn't know who also manifested to my younger son. All of that was a nightmare. It seemed like a horror movie, and I can say it ruined our dream trip. We went to a hotel for the rest of our vacation, but my children were very scared, and to tell the truth, so was I, so it was never the same. After that experience, we just wanted to return to our home. This was our terrible experience. I hope nothing similar happens to anyone else. My name is Eric, and what I'm about to tell you happened during what should have been one of the happiest weeks of my family's life. About 3 years ago, my brother was getting married in a charming small town in upstate New York. The wedding was planned for a Saturday, but we decided to arrive several days early to help with all the preparations. Instead of staying in a hotel, my parents and I rented a beautiful Airbnb through the app. The listing showed a stunning 2-story Victorian house that perfectly captured the essence of the historic town. The photos displayed colorful period furnishings and authentic 19th century charm that seemed to match the town's quaint atmosphere. We arrived in the early hours of Thursday morning, completely exhausted from the long drive. The house was even more beautiful in person than in the photos, with its wraparound porch and detailed woodwork. We were all so tired that we immediately headed to our rooms without really exploring the place. That first night passed peacefully, or at least I thought it did. None of us woke up during the night. We were simply too exhausted from the journey. The next morning, we left early to visit the wedding venue and meet with the florist to finalize all the arrangements. I have to be honest, I was already feeling pretty bored with all the wedding planning details. Looking at flower arrangements and discussing table linens wasn't exactly my idea of a good time. Around 5 in the afternoon, my mother noticed my lack of enthusiasm and suggested I take a walk around the town while they finished up. She said we'd meet back at the house that evening, and I immediately agreed. The late afternoon sun was intense, and the summer heat was becoming unbearable. Instead of wandering around town in that sweltering weather, I decided to head back to the house, take a refreshing shower, order some food delivery, and just relax for a while. I definitely didn't want to spend the rest of the day melting on the sidewalks. I got back to the house and immediately headed upstairs for a shower. It was almost 6 in the evening when I started hearing noises coming from downstairs. My first thought was that my parents had returned early, which seemed odd since they'd mentioned having dinner in town after finishing with the wedding preparations. I called out their names several times, but no one answered. Still wearing just a towel, I decided to go downstairs and check that everything was okay. Maybe someone had somehow gotten into the house. I could clearly hear the sounds, but when I searched the entire first floor, there was nobody there. Everything seemed to be in its proper place. I went back upstairs, got dressed, and opened a food delivery app to order dinner. After placing my order, I turned on the television and found a series to watch while waiting for the food to arrive. I lay down on the bed and had barely been watching for 5 minutes when I heard those sounds again from downstairs. But this time it was different. I could distinctly hear wheels, as if someone was riding a bicycle inside the house or dragging a cart across the floor. This struck me as extremely strange. I turned down the television volume to listen more carefully, and sure enough, I could hear the unmistakable sound of wheels and that characteristic squeaking noise that old equipment makes. I'll be honest, I was getting scared. I grabbed a pocket knife that I always carry with me and carefully made my way downstairs. But once again, there was nobody there. There was nothing with wheels anywhere to be seen, and everything remained exactly where it should be. The house was sparsely furnished with just the basic necessities, so I felt completely confused about what could be making those sounds. I returned upstairs and tried to continue watching the series. Some time passed when I received a notification that my food had been delivered. I ran downstairs. It was around 8 in the evening and starting to get dark outside. When I reached the front door, I saw the delivery driver in the street, getting back on his motorcycle and preparing to leave. I shouted to let him know that I was the one who had placed the order. He turned around and told me that he had already delivered it to the elderly lady in the wheelchair. I stood there speechless for several moments and looked toward the small patio area to see if anyone was there, but it was completely empty. I asked the driver which lady he was referring to, and he explained that an elderly woman had come out in her wheelchair, opened the door, and taken the food without saying a word. Seeing how pale I had become, he asked if I was feeling all right. I told him I was fine and thanked him, and then he drove away. I searched the entire house, including the small back patio that was more like a narrow hallway. I checked every room, but there was no elderly woman anywhere. When I entered the kitchen, I saw the food bag sitting there on the dining table. That's when every hair on my body stood on end. I ran upstairs as fast as I could to get my phone and call my parents. I didn't want to frighten them, but I asked where they were because I wanted to join them. They told me not to worry, that they had just asked for the check at the restaurant where they were having dinner and would be heading back to the house soon. During the short time it took for my parents to return, I stayed locked in the bedroom with the television on to help ease my fear. But it was almost useless because I could still hear those wheels squeaking. Now I knew it was the sound of a wheelchair, and I was certain it wasn't anyone living, at least not anyone who was still alive. When I heard my parents' voices, I immediately went downstairs and told them everything that had happened to me. I don't think they completely believed my story, but I begged them to leave and go to a hotel instead. They refused because we had already paid for a full week's stay, and they didn't want to waste the money. I felt hopeless, but that night my mother changed her mind. While we were all sleeping, I heard my mother scream from downstairs. I ran down the stairs with my father right ahead of me, both of us running and shouting to ask what was wrong. She was standing in the kitchen with a look of absolute terror on her face, almost in tears. She told us that she had come down to get some water and had seen an elderly woman pass by the back hallway in a wheelchair. The back door was open, so she had a clear view of that outside corridor. My father and I went out to investigate, but obviously there was nobody there. My mother, through tears, told us we needed to get out of that place immediately. She said she wouldn't be able to sleep another night in that house. So that's exactly what we did. Without saying anything to our host, we packed up and left that very night. The next day, I contacted the host to let her know that we wouldn't be staying for the remainder of our reservation, and thanked her for everything. She seemed very embarrassed and insisted on coming to the house to speak with us in person. I suspect she was worried that we might leave a bad review on the platform. My mother agreed to wait for her so they could talk, but our decision to leave was already final. When she arrived, it was the first time we had seen her in person. She was a young woman, probably around 35 years old at most, and seemed genuinely kind. She asked us what the reasons were for our early departure, saying that it was very important for her to know the truth. She confided in us that her previous guests had also left before completing their reserved stay, and she needed to know if it was for the same reason. My mother told her everything that had happened to me and also described what she herself had witnessed. The young woman was completely stunned. She told us that the previous guests had also seen the same elderly woman, and then she decided to tell us the truth. It turned out that the house had belonged to her grandmother, who had left it to her when she passed away. The young woman already had her own home and family, so she decided to rent it out through the app to earn some extra income. She explained that she had never been close to her grandmother because the elderly woman had stopped speaking to her daughter, the host's mother, when the host was just a child. She said her mother had told her that her grandmother was a woman with a very strong and unpleasant personality, which was why they never had a relationship with her. The elderly woman had died of a heart attack in that very house, and the young woman was surprised to inherit the property since they had rarely seen each other. But the grandmother had no other family to leave it to. She was very solitary and had lived alone. She shared all of this with us, hoping that we wouldn't leave a negative review. Perhaps that's why we hadn't seen any bad ratings when we originally booked the place. She had been very kind to all her guests, and that's usually enough to make people want to support someone in that situation. She mentioned that this rental income was currently her only source of money. I won't tell you whether I left her a bad review or not. I just wanted to share this story because it truly frightened me. Even now, I get goosebumps thinking about the fact that the spirit of that elderly woman is still there in that house, and that I was alone with her. It's something I wouldn't wish on anyone. My name is Benjamin. I'm 34 years old, and I live in San Antonio, Texas. I want to share a terrible experience that my wife and I had several years ago while staying in a house in Colorado that we rented through Airbnb. I want to make it clear that this wasn't the platform's fault, but I do want to share the horrible incident we experienced. As I mentioned, we went on vacation to a mountain town in Colorado that I prefer not to name specifically. The house was located in an area surrounded by dense forest, with thick vegetation all around. It was a lovely and comfortable neighborhood that seemed perfect for a peaceful getaway. We decided to take this trip during our summer vacation since we're both teachers and have that time off. We thought it would be nice to rent this beautiful and spacious house that cost about the same as staying in a hotel. And we obviously preferred having the entire house to ourselves. I should mention that the place had excellent reviews. We read all of them before booking, and every guest had left positive comments about both the house and the host, who was a young Asian man. When the day of our trip arrived, we reached the location full of excitement. The first thing we did was go to the house to drop off our luggage and get settled. Our host was already waiting for us there, and I have to say, he was very friendly throughout our interaction, although we had some difficulty understanding his English due to his accent. But that didn't prevent us from communicating effectively. The young man explained the house rules to us and gave us a tour of the property. He mentioned that there was an attic, but it was locked and off-limits to guests. We couldn't use it or go up there because it was filled with old furniture and tools. Of course, the attic was the last thing on our minds, so we didn't even give it a second thought. We were absolutely amazed by the house. It was beautiful both inside and out, with a large backyard and an incredible neighborhood that looked like something straight out of a movie. The host mentioned that some guests had just checked out that same day, so he apologized for the smell of bleach and cleaning products that lingered in the house. He and his wife had just finished cleaning everything thoroughly for our arrival. We certainly had no problem with that. In fact, we appreciated that they cleaned so thoroughly after having previous guests. After he left, we settled in to unpack our belongings. My wife went out to the backyard where there were 2 lounge chairs, and she lay down to relax with a soda while I took a shower. I was feeling very sweaty and wanted to clean up before we went out to explore the town. When I came out of the shower, I found my wife coming back into the bedroom. She told me she wasn't sure if it had been her imagination, but she thought she had seen someone pass by the attic window. The window faced the backyard where she had been lying, but she couldn't tell if it was just the shadow of a bird flying by, or if she had actually seen someone inside. I told her it was probably just the shadow of a tree branch or a bird, as she had suggested. I advised her not to worry about it, and she smiled and agreed with me. Then she said we should head out because she was excited to explore the town. We spent the entire afternoon out and about, returning to the house around 10 in the evening. I have to admit that in the darkness, the house did look somewhat imposing and eerie. When we entered and turned on the lights, it didn't feel the same as when we had arrived during the day. There was a distinctly strange atmosphere in the place. It's odd because my wife and I both noticed it at the same time. We mentioned it to each other and agreed that something felt off about the house, something that made us feel uneasy. We went straight upstairs to the bedroom, and my wife went to take a shower while I lay down on the bed to watch television. Suddenly, I heard sounds as if something had fallen in the attic. I didn't want to go investigate anything. I simply locked the bedroom door and waited for my wife to finish her shower. When she came out, I told her what I had heard, and she asked if we should call the police. I told her no, that it was probably just rats up there that had knocked something over. I didn't want to frighten her more than necessary, so we left it at that and went to sleep. Throughout the night, I continued to hear things, but I didn't want to wake my wife or go check what was causing the sounds. I'm not stupid enough to go investigating strange noises in the middle of the night. The next morning, we woke up to a very peculiar smell throughout the house. Something smelled terrible, like something had gone bad, but it was an extremely strong odor. My wife and I both noticed it immediately after waking up. She covered her nose and asked what smelled so awful. I told her I didn't know, but I would go find out. I left the room while she stayed inside because she couldn't tolerate the smell. I followed that distinctive odor until I reached the area where the stairs to the attic were located. They were the kind that fold up and become part of the ceiling. You have to pull them down to access the attic. But I noticed they had a lock mechanism, and I remembered that the host had told us the attic was locked, and guests were prohibited from going up there. Even so, I brought a ladder from the kitchen and pulled down the attic stairs. To my surprise, there was no padlock. It was completely unlocked. That horrible smell was definitely coming from up there, and it intensified dramatically when I opened the stairs. My wife came out of the bedroom and saw me climbing up to the attic. She asked in an alarmed voice what I was doing, reminding me that we weren't allowed up there. But I told her I had to go see what was causing that smell, because I was certain it was coming from that location. When I climbed up, I turned on my phone's flashlight. At first, I couldn't see anything except old furniture and items covered with sheets. But as I walked toward the back of the space, I saw something horrible that I can't erase from my memory to this day. Lying on the floor was the body of a young woman, approximately 19 years old. She had a cut across her throat, her eyes were open, but she was clearly dead. Her body was already in a state of decomposition. I didn't scream, I didn't do anything. I couldn't speak. My wife was shouting from below, asking desperately if I was okay, and when she saw that I wasn't responding, I heard her starting to climb the attic stairs. That's when I snapped back to reality. I ran to stop her and told her not to come up under any circumstances. I made her go back down immediately, and I climbed down behind her. With my hand trembling, I dialed 911. My wife didn't understand what was happening, but when she heard what I told the operator, she covered her mouth in disbelief and ran downstairs and out of the house. I chose not to call the host because I didn't know how involved he might be in this crime. I didn't want to put us at risk, so I decided to call emergency services immediately. 2 police cars arrived at the scene. I explained the situation to them, and they asked for the name of the person who had rented us the house. They immediately called him and asked him to come to the property. We waited outside while they cordoned off the area. They wouldn't even let us retrieve our belongings, because everything was now part of a crime scene. They questioned us and took our statements. Later, our host arrived, looking just as shocked as we were. He ran toward us asking if we were okay, and I responded that no, we couldn't possibly be okay after seeing what was up there. An officer then called him over to give his statement. To make this story shorter, he had nothing to do with that horrible crime. It turned out that the previous guests had been a group of young people who had rented the house for a weekend getaway, including that poor girl we found deceased. The host never went up to clean the attic because he had no reason to do so. Since guests were supposedly never allowed up there, he had no idea what was above. He also hadn't noticed that the lock had been forced open. They arrested 4 young people, 2 men and 2 women, who had stayed there before us, along with the girl who was found dead. According to the investigation, they had killed her. The girls claimed that it was the two young men who committed the murder. They said that on their last night there, she had rejected one of them when he wanted to be intimate with her. When she refused, he became angry, and along with his friend, they took her life. Nobody knows why those girls didn't call the police either at the time or after they left the location. They simply stated that they had been threatened by their male friends and were too afraid to speak up. The young woman who died was only 18 years old. We experienced the unthinkable during what we thought would be one of the best vacations of our lives. We still have no idea who was making those noises in the attic that first night. Perhaps it was the same young woman trying to make sure someone would find her. But those are just our theories. After that experience, we only stay in hotels now. Even though neither the platform nor the host was at fault, it's very difficult to regain the confidence to stay in strangers' homes. This happened about 4 years ago when I was driving from San Antonio to visit my girlfriend in Tucson. She'd moved there to attend graduate school, and I was making the 8-hour drive to surprise her for her birthday. I'd left San Antonio around 6 in the evening, thinking I could drive straight through and arrive by 2 in the morning. But I'd seriously underestimated how exhausting the drive would be, especially at night through the desert. By the time I reached the outskirts of El Paso, I was struggling to keep my eyes open. I knew I had to stop before I caused an accident. That's when I spotted the sign for the Desert Rose Motor Lodge, an old roadside motel that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1960s. It wasn't exactly my first choice, but honestly, what reason would anyone have for staying in these places unless they absolutely had to? The parking lot was completely empty, and when I walked up to the office, I found it locked with a sign that said, "Ring bell for service." I pressed the buzzer and waited, but nothing happened. I was about to get back in my car and look for another place when I saw a light come on inside. An elderly woman appeared from a back room, shuffling slowly toward the front door. She was wearing a faded pink bathrobe and looked like she'd been sleeping. Through the glass door, I could see her fumbling around, apparently looking for her keys. "Just a minute, honey," she called out. "I know they're here somewhere." While I waited, I couldn't help but think how dangerous it was for an old woman to be running this place all by herself. The motel was in the middle of nowhere, at least 20 miles from the nearest town. Anyone could break in if they really wanted to. Finally, she got the door open and greeted me with a warm smile. "Sorry about the wait, dear. I was sound asleep and couldn't remember where I put the office keys." She was incredibly friendly and apologetic about making me wait. When I asked if she was running the place alone, she nodded and explained that the motel had been in her family for generations. Her husband had passed away several years earlier, and she'd been managing it by herself ever since. "I tried hiring help a few times," she said, "but people kept stealing from me. So I figured it was better to be alone than to deal with dishonest employees." Then she said something that struck me as odd. "Besides, I'm well protected here. I have forces watching over me, so I don't worry about being alone." She said it with such confidence and certainty that I didn't know how to respond. I just smiled and told her I was glad she felt safe. The motel was small, maybe 8 rooms total, plus the office where she apparently lived. My room was modest but clean, which was all I really cared about. But when I walked inside and turned on the lights, I froze. There were antique porcelain dolls everywhere. They were arranged throughout the room like decorations, some sitting on the bed, others lined up along a shelf on the wall, and several positioned in the armchair by the window. They were the old-fashioned kind with painted faces, glass eyes, and elaborate Victorian dresses. The kind that always seemed to be watching you no matter where you move. I counted at least 15 dolls, all staring in different directions with their lifeless glass eyes. It was deeply unsettling, but I was too tired to drive any further. I put in my earbuds and tried to ignore them while I got ready for bed. I was just starting to doze off when I heard a loud thud. I pulled out my earbuds and turned on my phone's flashlight. One of the dolls that had been sitting in the armchair was now lying on the floor. I stared at it, trying to figure out how it could have fallen. The chair was large and deep, and the doll had been positioned well back from the edge, surrounded by other dolls. There was no way it could have just toppled over on its own. I got up and put the doll back in the chair, then climbed back into bed and pulled the covers over my head. I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, that there had to be a logical explanation. But then I started hearing small sounds around the room, subtle creaking noises, like someone moving around very quietly. I stayed under the blanket, afraid to look, telling myself it was just the old building settling. That's when I heard another loud crash. I threw off the covers and turned on the light. Another doll had fallen, this time from the shelf on the wall. It was lying on the floor about 3 feet from where the shelf was mounted, much too far to have simply fallen straight down. What made it even stranger was that the doll was completely undamaged. These old porcelain dolls are supposed to be extremely fragile, but this one didn't have so much as a chip or crack, even though it had fallen from at least 5 feet up onto a hardwood floor. I got up to examine the doll more closely, and that's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The first doll, the one that had fallen from the chair, was no longer lying on its side where it had landed. It was now sitting upright on the floor, its glass eyes looking directly toward the bed where I'd been lying. I know I had left it lying on its side because I remembered thinking how unnatural it looked in that position. But now, it was sitting up perfectly straight, as if someone had carefully positioned it that way. I grabbed my clothes and keys and headed for the door. I didn't care how tired I was. I wasn't spending another minute in that room. But as I was leaving, I happened to glance back at the office window. The old woman was standing there in the darkness, watching me. Even from across the parking lot, I could see that she was smiling, not a friendly smile, but a wide, unsettling grin that seemed to stretch from ear to ear. I got in my car and drove away as fast as I could. I ended up driving straight through to Tucson, fueled by adrenaline and about 6 cups of coffee from various gas stations along the way. I never found out what kind of arrangement that old woman had made with whatever dark forces were inhabiting those dolls. I don't want to know. But I learned my lesson that night. I'll never stay in another roadside motel again, no matter how tired I am. Some places and some people are connected to things that are better left undisturbed. The Desert Rose Motor Lodge was definitely one of those places, and I'm just grateful I got out of there when I did. To this day, I can't look at antique dolls without feeling a chill run down my spine. And whenever I'm driving at night, and see one of those lonely motel signs glowing in the distance. I just keep driving until I find a well-lit hotel in a populated area. Some risks just aren't worth taking, no matter how convenient they might seem at the time. My wife Jennifer and I have been taking road trips across the United States for the past 15 years. Ever since we moved here from Canada, we've made it a tradition to explore different parts of the country every summer. We love the freedom of the open road and the adventure of discovering small towns and hidden gems that you can only find when you're driving. This particular trip was supposed to take us from our home in Portland, Oregon, down to Los Angeles, then across to Phoenix, and back north through Nevada and Utah. We'd been driving for about 10 hours and were somewhere in the middle of California's Central Valley when we realized we needed to find a place to stop for the night. It was getting late, and we were still several hours away from our planned hotel in Bakersfield. Jennifer was checking our phone for nearby accommodations, but she wasn't having much luck finding anything with good reviews. "There's supposed to be a motel about 20 miles ahead," she said, squinting at the small screen. "But it's not showing up on any of the booking apps." "That's weird," I said. "Maybe it's just really old and hasn't got online yet." We kept driving until we saw a faded sign for the Silver Star Motor Lodge. The sign was so old and weathered that we almost missed it, and the access road was narrow and poorly marked. But we were both exhausted, and it looked like our best option. The motel was a classic two-story structure from what looked like the 1950s or 60s. The parking lot had maybe 6 or 7 cars scattered around, so it wasn't completely deserted, which was reassuring. The elderly woman at the front desk was pleasant enough, though she seemed a bit surprised to see us. "We don't get many folks just passing through," she said as she handed us our room key. "Most of our guests are here for specific reasons." I wasn't sure what she meant by that, but I was too tired to ask. Our room was on the 2nd floor, accessible by an exterior staircase that creaked with every step. The room itself was clean, but obviously hadn't been updated in decades. What dominated the space was an enormous vanity mirror mounted on the wall directly across from the bed. It was the kind of setup you might find in an old Hollywood hotel room, a large mirror with lights around the frame and a small bench positioned in front of it. Jennifer immediately went to the mirror to brush her hair and get ready for bed. "At least we'll be able to see ourselves clearly in the morning," she joked, admiring the size of the mirror. I turned off the lights, and we both settled into bed. Jennifer falls asleep easily, but I've always been a light sleeper, especially in unfamiliar places. I must have been dozing for a couple of hours when Jennifer shook me awake. "John," she whispered, "do you hear that?" I listened carefully and could make out faint sounds coming from somewhere in our room, soft murmuring voices, like people having a quiet conversation. "It's probably just coming from one of the other rooms," I said. "The walls in these old places are pretty thin." But Jennifer shook her head. "No, it's coming from inside our room. Listen carefully." She was right. The sounds were definitely originating from somewhere within our room, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly where. The voices were too quiet to make out individual words, but there seemed to be multiple people talking at once. I got up and checked the bathroom, the closet, and even looked under the bed, but I couldn't find any source for the sounds. They seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. "Maybe it's the air conditioning or the plumbing," I suggested, though I knew that didn't really explain the voice-like quality of what we were hearing. Jennifer didn't look convinced, but she agreed to try to go back to sleep. I lay there listening to the murmuring for a while longer, But eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off. The next time I woke up, Jennifer was gripping my arm tightly and whispering urgently in my ear. "John, look at the mirror." I opened my eyes and looked toward the vanity mirror across from our bed. What I saw there will stay with me for the rest of my life. The mirror was filled with dark, shifting shadows that moved independently of anything in our room. They weren't reflections of us or our surroundings. They were separate entities that seemed to exist only within the mirror itself. The shadows had vaguely human shapes, but were distorted and elongated, like people viewed through warped glass. They moved around within the mirror's surface, sometimes clustering together, sometimes spreading apart, but always in constant motion. And the murmuring we'd heard earlier was definitely coming from these shadow figures. Their voices rose and fell in what sounded like conversation, occasionally punctuated by what might have been laughter. Though it was unlike any laughter I'd ever heard, Jennifer and I lay there transfixed, afraid to move or make any sound that might draw their attention. The shadows seemed oblivious to our presence at first, going about whatever business they were conducting within the mirror. But then one of them, a tall, thin figure that moved with more purpose than the others, seemed to notice us watching. It stopped moving and turned in our direction, though it had no discernible face or features. The other shadows gradually became aware of us as well, and their murmuring grew louder and more agitated. They began pressing against what appeared to be the inside surface of the mirror, as if they were trying to push through the glass into our room. "Turn on the light," Jennifer whispered. "Turn on the light right now." I was afraid to move, worried that any sudden motion might somehow allow these things to break through into our reality. But Jennifer was right. We had to do something. She reached over and switched on the bedside lamp. The moment the light filled the room, the shadows vanished completely. Mirror showed only our normal reflection and the room behind us. We both sat up and stared at the mirror for several minutes, but it remained perfectly normal. Whatever we'd seen was gone, at least for the moment. "We're leaving," Jennifer said, already getting out of bed. "I don't care what time it is. We're getting out of here right now." I couldn't have agreed more. We packed our things as quickly as possible, and I went to examine the mirror more closely before we left. I moved the vanity away from the wall to see if there might be some kind of projection system or hidden camera that could explain what we'd witnessed. But it was just an ordinary mirror mounted on an ordinary wall. There was nothing behind it, nothing special about the glass itself, nothing that could account for what we'd seen. As we loaded our car, I noticed that the other vehicles in the parking lot looked like they'd been there for a long time. They were covered in dust and had that abandoned look that cars get when they've been sitting in one place for weeks or months. We drove straight through to Los Angeles, taking turns at the wheel when one of us got tired. Neither of us wanted to stop at another roadside motel after what we'd experienced. Later, when we had access to better internet, Jennifer did some research about mirrors and paranormal activity. She found several articles suggesting that mirrors can sometimes act as portals or windows between different dimensions or planes of existence. Whether or not you believe in that kind of thing, I can tell you that we removed every mirror from our bedroom when we got home. We also make sure to request rooms without large mirrors whenever we travel now. Some people might say we overreacted, but I know what we saw that night. Those shadows were real, and they were trying to find a way into our world. I'm just grateful that the barrier between their realm and ours held, and that we had the sense to get out of there when we did. The Silver Star Motor Lodge might still be operating. I honestly don't know and don't want to find out. But if you're ever driving through California's Central Valley and see that faded sign, I'd strongly recommend you keep driving until you find somewhere else to stay. Some doorways are better left unopened, and some reflections are better left unseen. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I used to work as a party entertainer, traveling across the Midwest in my van, setting up at birthday parties, corporate events, and community festivals. This was back in 2018, before I settled down and opened my restaurant in Chicago. During those years on the road, I had my share of strange experiences, but none quite like what happened one October night in rural Kansas. I was driving from Topeka to Wichita for a Halloween event, a long haul that would take me through some pretty desolate country. I'd done the drive before, but never at night, and certainly never when I was this tired. I just finished a 3-day festival in Kansas City and was running on maybe 4 hours of sleep over the past 48 hours. Around 2:30 in the morning, I was fighting to keep my eyes open. The highway was completely empty, hadn't seen another car for at least 30 minutes. That's when I spotted the neon sign for the Sunset Motor Lodge, one of those old-fashioned roadside motels that probably hadn't been updated since the 1970s. The parking lot had maybe 3 cars in it, which was actually more than I expected for a place that far from anywhere. I figured one belonged to whoever was working the night shift, and the others were probably truckers or other travelers like me who couldn't make it to their destination. The lobby was small and cramped, with wood paneling on the walls and carpet that had seen better decades. Behind the desk was an elderly man with thick glasses, probably in his 70s, reading a paperback novel. He looked up when I walked in and gave me a friendly smile. "Little late to be on the road, isn't it, son?" "Tell me about it," I said. "Just need a room for a few hours. Got to be in Wichita by noon." He handed me a registration card and a key attached to a large plastic diamond with 14 written on it. "Second floor, end of the hall. Nice and quiet up there." I was grateful for that. I've always been a light sleeper, and the last thing I needed was to be kept awake by slamming doors or loud conversations from other guests. Room 14 was exactly what I expected from a place like that: twin bed, with a faded floral bedspread, wood grain furniture that was probably older than I was, and a window air conditioning unit that rattled when it ran. But it was clean enough, and all I needed was a place to crash for a few hours. I kicked off my shoes and collapsed onto the bed without even changing clothes. I was exhausted, and sleep came almost immediately, but it didn't last long. I woke up maybe 2 hours later to the sound of voices coming through the wall. At first, I thought it was just normal conversation between guests in the next room, but as I became more alert, I realized it sounded like a party. Multiple voices, both male and female, talking and laughing loudly enough that I could hear them clearly through what should have been fairly thick walls. I checked my phone, 4:15 in the morning. Who has a party at 4 in the morning at a roadside motel? The voices continued for what felt like hours. I couldn't make out specific words, but the tone was definitely celebratory. Occasional bursts of laughter, the sound of what might have been music playing softly in the background, and the general buzz of multiple conversations happening at once. I tried using my pillow to muffle the sound, but it didn't help much. The voices would die down for a while, maybe 10 or 15 minutes, then start up again just as I was drifting back to sleep. It was incredibly frustrating, but I didn't want to call the front desk and complain. For all I knew, these were regular customers, and I was just the outsider causing problems. By 6 in the morning, I was completely exhausted and more than a little irritated. The party had been going on for nearly 2 hours straight, and I had to be on the road soon to make my appointment in Wichita. Just as I was seriously considering going downstairs to complain, everything suddenly went quiet. I waited a few minutes to make sure they were really done, then decided to get up and take a shower. Maybe I could salvage an hour of actual sleep before I had to check out. As I was gathering my things, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my room. I looked through the peephole and saw a middle-aged Hispanic woman pushing a housekeeping cart. She was moving slowly, quietly, obviously trying not to disturb any guests who might still be sleeping. I opened the door and stepped out. "Excuse me, ma'am," she looked up, a bit startled. "Oh, good morning. I'm sorry if I woke you." "No, you didn't wake me. Actually, I was wondering, did the people next door just leave? There was quite a party going on in there all night." Her expression changed to one of confusion. "Party? Which room are you talking about?" I pointed to the door directly next to mine. "Room 13. They were pretty loud until just a few minutes ago." She shook her head slowly. "Sir, that room has been empty all week. In fact, you're the only guest on this entire floor." I stared at her, trying to process what she just said. "That's impossible. I heard at least 4 or 5 people in there, talking and laughing for hours. I promise you, there's nobody in that room. The manager told me last night that we only had 3 guests total, and they're all on the first floor." She pulled out a master key and walked over to room 13. "Would you like me to show you?" I followed her, expecting to find evidence of the party: empty bottles, moved furniture, something to prove I hadn't imagined the whole thing. But when she opened the door, the room was pristine. The bed was made with military precision. Towels were folded neatly in the bathroom, and there wasn't a single sign that anyone had been there recently. "Maybe you were dreaming," she suggested gently. "Sometimes when people are really tired, they can have very vivid dreams." But I knew I hadn't been dreaming. I'd been awake, lying in bed, listening to those voices for hours. I thanked her and went back to my room, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I checked out 20 minutes later, paid my bill, and got back on the road to Wichita. But I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. During the drive, I kept coming back to the same questions. Who had I heard? Where had the voices come from? And why did that housekeeper seem so certain the room had been empty? After I finished my gig in Wichita, I drove straight home to Chicago, but the experience stayed with me. A few days later, I decided to do some research on the Sunset Motor Lodge. I found their website easily enough, but something seemed off about the photos. The lobby looked different somehow, and the name wasn't quite right. It took some digging, but I eventually found an old newspaper article that explained the discrepancy. The motel had changed names twice in the past 20 years. Originally, it had been called the Prairie Inn, then briefly the Kansas Star Motor Lodge, before becoming the Sunset. But that wasn't the shocking discovery. What made my blood run cold was a newspaper story from October 2003. A group of college students from Kansas State had been staying in room 13 during their fall break, having what the article described as a private party. Sometime after 3 in the morning, an armed robbery had gone wrong. 3 men had broken into the room, apparently looking for money and drugs. When the students couldn't give them what they wanted, the situation escalated. All 5 students were killed. The perpetrators were never caught. The article included a photo of the crime scene police cars in the parking lot, officers going in and out of a second-floor room. Room 13. The same room where I'd heard the party sounds all night. I stared at that article for a long time, trying to rationalize what I'd experienced. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe my exhausted mind had played tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. Those voices I'd heard weren't coming from a party happening that night. They were echoes of a party that had ended in tragedy 15 years earlier. Somehow, those young people were still there, still celebrating, still unaware that their lives had been cut short in that very room. I've told this story to dozens of people over the years. Some believe me, others think I was just overtired and imagining things. But I know what I heard that night. And sometimes, late at night when I'm alone, I wonder if they're still there, still having their eternal party in room 13. I never drove past that motel again. Took different routes after that, even if they added hours to my trips. Some places are better left undisturbed, and some sounds are better left unheard. The living and the dead aren't meant to share the same space. And when they do, it leaves a mark on everyone involved. I still think about those students, sometimes young people just trying to have fun, with no idea that their celebration would become their last. In a way, maybe it's not such a terrible fate. If you have to be trapped somewhere for eternity, at least they're trapped in a moment of joy, rather than fear or sadness. But it's a reminder that our world is full of things we don't understand, places where the past refuses to stay buried, and sounds that echo long after their sources have fallen silent. I hope you can share my story because it's worth telling. This was the first paranormal event that my wife and I experienced together. About 2 years ago, my wife and I were newlyweds, so we decided to take a trip to a romantic destination. I'll just say that it was in Costa Rica. For this trip, my wife booked a beautiful and affordable apartment for our vacation through the platform. We arrived there, and everything was excellent. The place was truly gorgeous. It had a beautiful view and also a small swimming pool. Everything was going wonderfully. Our host was also very kind throughout our stay and welcomed us with many thoughtful touches. She also answered some questions we had about the city. During the day, everything went normally, but it was the first night when things started to happen. My wife has always suffered from insomnia, so while I fall asleep quickly, it takes her hours to be able to fall asleep. She always stays up reading a book because that helps her sleep. That night, I was already sleeping because we'd had a very long travel day and I was exhausted. My wife was reading her book as usual. But around 2 in the morning, she woke me up because she said she heard something in the patio where the pool was located. She looked out because our bedroom had a large window that faced directly toward the pool area. You could see the entire patio from there, but she didn't see anything. So she went back to reading her book. But after a few minutes, she could hear that same noise for a second time, as if someone were in the pool. She says she heard it so clearly that she believed someone was actually in there. But when she checked again, she saw nothing. That's when she woke me up, because she was starting to feel afraid. I told her to wait for me in the bedroom, so I went down very carefully to the first floor and even opened the door that led to the patio to look around. but there was nobody there. So I returned to the bedroom and told my wife to calm down. I suggested that maybe it had been a cat, but that I had already checked and there was nobody there. So I lay back down to sleep. I don't know how much time passed. It must have been just a few minutes when a loud noise from downstairs made me open my eyes suddenly. My wife said to me, "Now do you believe me?" I had always believed her, but this time I could also hear it clearly. So I looked out through the window and saw how the pool water was moving as if someone had just gotten out of it. It was very strange because there was no wind that could have caused such abrupt movement of the water. My wife wouldn't let me go downstairs again because she was so frightened. So she sent a message to the host to tell her what was happening, but I suppose because of the late hour, she didn't respond. That's how we spent the night, scared. We didn't hear anything else, but we didn't sleep peacefully either. The next morning, my wife received a message from the host apologizing for not having responded. She said that she takes sleeping pills that make her sleep very deeply, and once she's asleep, she can't hear anything, not even her phone. That day she came to the apartment and was very kind. She apologized to us and told us that she didn't know what it could have been. She said she had already checked the security cameras of the place, but nobody appeared on them. She seemed very embarrassed. We honestly felt sorry for her seeing her like that, so we just told her not to worry, that maybe it had been a cat, and we acted calm so she could leave without concern. The day went by normally. We spent the entire day out as tourists and were very relaxed. We returned to the apartment at midnight, exhausted after a full day of walking and exploring the city. My wife was taking a shower, and I was already in bed on my phone, when suddenly those sounds started again, coming from downstairs. I looked out almost immediately to see if this time I could see who was making those noises. And I saw the water moving again, as if someone were getting out of the pool. Without telling my wife anything, I went down to the first floor, and there, on that glass door, I could see the prints of small hands with water running from them. I was absolutely terrified. Even though the handprints seemed to be from a child, I went back up immediately. My wife was already in bed asking me where I had gone. I couldn't hide the truth from her, so she decided to come down with me to see those handprints. They were still there, but when my wife turned on the outside light, we saw that there was also water on the patio floor, as if someone had gotten out of the pool and walked to the glass door. At that moment, I felt we were in danger, so we checked the entire patio, but there was nobody there. So my wife decided to call the host again, and this time she did answer and immediately came to the apartment. Once again, she was very embarrassed about what was happening. She kindly showed us the security camera recordings on her phone, and indeed, you could see the water moving. But the hands suddenly appeared on the glass, and there was nobody there. After that, she told us something very uncomfortable and terrifying. Apparently, she used to live there with her husband and their 5-year-old daughter. But one day, the little girl was playing in the patio and fell into the pool. Her father was working, and the woman was in the kitchen making lunch, so she didn't realize the accident until it was too late. Her daughter died by drowning in the pool. She apologized to us for everything and told us that if we wanted to leave, there would be no problem. She said she would return the money for the remaining nights we had reserved. We honestly didn't know how to react after hearing that and seeing the woman so sad and crying. We felt terrible for her, but at the same time, we were very afraid after that experience. So we decided to leave that same night, but we didn't accept the money the woman wanted to return to us. We already felt bad enough about the situation. But one thing was certain. Neither my wife nor I were going to be able to continue sleeping in that place. I was 19 years old and had just moved from Vancouver to Sacramento to live with my mother and help support our household. My parents had divorced when I was younger, and I'd been living with my father and stepmother in Canada. But when tensions at home became unbearable, my mother offered me a fresh start in California. The plan was simple. I'd work for a year to save money, then use my earnings to enroll in community college and eventually transfer to a 4-year university. My mother had connections in the hospitality industry and heard about a night desk position at a small motel on the outskirts of town. The Starlight Motor Lodge was owned by an older gentleman named Mr. Peterson, who seemed desperate to fill the position. His previous night clerk had quit without notice, leaving him scrambling to cover the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift himself. When I showed up for the interview, he hired me on the spot. "The pay is $18 an hour," he said, "and honestly, most nights you won't have much to do. We get very few walk-in guests during the week, especially in the winter months." It was January, and he was right about the slow season. The motel looked like it had been built in the 1960s and hadn't been updated much since then. Everything had a tired, dated feel to it: the floral wallpaper, the wood-paneled walls, the old rotary phone behind the front desk. Mr. Peterson showed me around the property, explaining the basic procedures for checking in guests, handling complaints, and managing the few maintenance issues that might arise during my shift. The building was small, maybe 20 rooms total, and was laid out in a horseshoe shape around a central courtyard. "The most important thing to remember," he said as we finished the tour, "is that you'll be completely alone here from 11 until 7. I live about 15 minutes away, so if there's a real emergency, you can call me. But most nights, you'll just be reading or studying." My first few weeks on the job were exactly as he described. I'd check in maybe 1 or 2 guests per night, usually travelers who'd gotten a late start or truckers looking for a place to rest. The rest of the time, I'd work on my GED prep materials or read books I'd borrowed from the library. The isolation didn't bother me at first. I'd always been comfortable with solitude, and the quiet gave me time to think about my future and what I wanted to study in college. The old building creaked and settled throughout the night, but I got used to those sounds quickly enough. Everything changed on a Tuesday night in early February. I was sitting behind the front desk, working through a practice math test, when the phone rang. The caller ID showed that it was coming from room 7, which surprised me because I was certain we didn't have any guests that night. No one had checked in during my shift, and Mr. Peterson hadn't mentioned anyone staying over from the day shift. I answered the phone with my standard greeting. "Front desk, how can I help you?" No one responded, but I could hear that someone was on the line. The connection was active, but whoever was calling wasn't speaking. "Hello," I tried again. "Is anyone there?" Still nothing. After waiting about 30 seconds, I hung up and made a note to check room 7 when I made my rounds later that night. I went back to my studying, but about 10 minutes later, the phone rang again. Same caller ID, room 7. This time, when I answered, I could hear something on the other end that made my skin crawl. It was the sound of a woman crying, followed immediately by maniacal laughter. The crying and laughing seemed to be coming from the same person, alternating back and forth in a way that sounded completely unhinged. I hung up immediately and sat there staring at the phone, my heart racing. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe someone was playing a prank, or maybe there was some kind of technical malfunction with the phone system. I decided to walk over to room 7 and investigate. I grabbed the master key and a flashlight from the desk drawer and headed outside. The courtyard was dimly lit by a few old-fashioned lamp posts, and my footsteps echoed off the concrete as I walked toward room 7. When I reached the door, I could see that the lights inside were off, and there was no sound coming from within. I knocked on the door several times, calling out, "Hotel maintenance, is everything okay in there?" No response. I used the master key to open the door and switched on the lights. The room was completely empty and appeared to have been cleaned recently. The bed was made, the towels were fresh, and there was no sign that anyone had been there. I checked the bathroom, looked under the bed, and even examined the phone to see if there might be some kind of malfunction that could explain the calls. Everything seemed normal, confused, and a bit unnerved. I locked the room and returned to the front desk. I made a note about the incident in the logbook and tried to focus on my studying. Around 3 a.m., the phone rang again. Room 7. This time I decided not to answer it. I let it ring 15 or 20 times before it finally stopped. But then, just as I was starting to relax, it started ringing again. I picked up the receiver without saying anything, just to see what would happen. After a few seconds of silence, I heard a woman's voice ask, "Who's calling?" The question caught me off guard because I should have been the one asking that. Before I could respond, the voice continued, "I can hear you breathing. I know you're there." And came that horrible combination of crying and laughing again, even louder and more disturbing than before. I slammed the phone down and immediately called Mr. Peterson at home. It took him several rings to answer, and when he did, he sounded groggy and confused. "Mr. Peterson, this is Maria at the motel," I said. "I'm getting some really strange phone calls from room 7, but when I checked the room, it was empty." There was a long pause before he responded. "Room 7. Are you sure that's where the calls are coming from?" "Yes, sir. The caller ID shows room 7 every time." Another pause. "Maria, I need to tell you something. We don't rent out room 7 anymore. We haven't for about 2 years now." "What do you mean?" "There was an incident in that room," he said slowly. "A woman was murdered there by her boyfriend. He killed her and then killed himself. Since then, we've had problems with that room." My blood ran cold. "What kind of problems?" "Guests complained about strange noises, phone calls to and from the room when it was supposed to be empty, voices coming from inside when no one was there. I finally decided it was easier to just take it out of service than deal with the complaints. I looked across the courtyard toward room 7, and for a moment I thought I saw a light flickering in the window. But when I looked more carefully, the room was dark. "Mr. Peterson, I think I need to leave early tonight," I said. "This is really freaking me out." "I understand completely," he replied. "The last 3 night clerks all quit because of problems with that room. I should have warned you, but I was hoping it had stopped." He paused, then added, "You know what? Why don't you take the rest of the week off? I'll cover the shifts myself while I figure out what to do about this." I gratefully accepted his offer and spent the rest of that night at my mother's house, telling her everything that had happened. She was supportive, but clearly worried about me continuing to work in that environment. A few days later, Mr. Peterson called to tell me that he'd decided to close the motel permanently. "I can't keep putting employees through this," he said. "And honestly, I can't afford to keep losing night clerks every few weeks." He gave me a generous severance package and helped me find a job at a hotel downtown that was much more modern and hopefully much less haunted. I never found out what happened to the Starlight Motor Lodge after Mr. Peterson closed it. I drove by a few months later and saw that the building was still there, but looked abandoned. Part of me was curious about whether the paranormal activity continued even after the place was empty, but I never worked up the courage to investigate. I did eventually get my GED and went on to community college, just as I'd planned. I studied business management and now work in hotel administration for a major chain. Ironically, I ended up in the same industry where I'd had my terrifying experience, but I make sure to only work in new, well-populated hotels. Whenever I train new employees, I always tell them to trust their instincts about unusual situations. Some places carry the weight of past tragedies, and no job is worth risking your mental health or personal safety. The Starlight Motor Lodge taught me that lesson in the most frightening way possible, but I'm grateful I learned it early in my career. Some experiences, no matter how terrifying, can end up shaping you into a stronger and wiser person. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.